Welcome to the audiobook of Jitterball by P.A. Mason, a new cozy fantasy mystery in the Gretchen's New Adventures series. Chapter 1. Jumping Jellyfish. Is that even allowed? Gretchen pitched her voice so Nora could hear her over the roaring crowd. Nora brushed back iron-gray curls whipping around her face and kept her eyes on the field below where the team of goblins were gaining on the ogres. A heaving ogre lay prone on the grass, and Gretchen imagined he would sport a mean headache for the rest of the week. He took him on. Nora held up her arms, clenching her teeth. Gretchen, clad only in her drab black dress, despite the evening chill taking hold of the stadium, thrust her hands into one of the many pockets sewn into her skirts to keep her hands warm and leaned forward with a puzzled frown as she tried to decipher what was going on. A goblin streaked forward, a leather ball tucked under his armpit. Narrowly avoiding a defender, he scampered up a tree on their scoring end. As he cleared the dense branches toward the wide nest at the top, the ogres launched smaller balls in the goblin's direction. Nora clawed Gretchen's arm and hissed, "Since when have you been a fan of Jitterball, anyhow?" Gretchen winced as one of the smaller balls smacked the goblin's shoulder. He wavered, and the crowd fell silent. Then he planted the ball into the nest and howled with victory. Nora flew out of her seat with a screech, her jowls wobbling, and she whooped with excitement. When she sat with a wide grin, she turned to Gretchen as the field rearranged themselves to prepare for the new ball. "You should have seen me back in my heyday. I had plans on making it to the Major League." The stadium, a colossal structure of weathered stone and aging metal, loomed around the cheering crowd like a behemoth. Gretchen wagered it was larger than the castle itself, but as drafty as old castles were, the open top of the stadium did even less to keep the bitter wind out. Rows upon rows of wooden seats, worn by years of use, cascaded down toward the brightly lit green field below, where the frenzied game unfolded amidst a cacophony of shouts and roars. Gretchen twisted her orange braid around her neck as a makeshift scarf and shivered. "Well, I think you missed the boat on that one," she observed dryly. From their vantage in the nosebleeds, Gretchen watched the spectators shuffle in their seats, waiting for play to resume. That late in the game, some of the rowdier supporters were ruddy-cheeked and slurring, and the scent of ale hung heavy in the air. Gretchen had long abandoned the meat pie congealing in its paper wrapper beside her, and wished she'd insisted on stopping by the potion shop on their way to the stadium. A flask of witch's brew would have been just the ticket right about then. The odds were on the beefy ogres, and she figured Nora was the only person who'd placed a wager on the smaller goblins. But despite knowing nothing about Jitterball, Gretchen had seen goblins climb trees, and thought the bookkeepers daft for favoring the stockier species. It wasn't often that one saw a goblin in the city, though, and from what Gretchen could gather, the event seemed to have drawn a larger than usual crowd. The referee blew his horn. Then things happened too quickly for Gretchen to keep up. Ogres tackled goblins to the ground, the ball lying forgotten on the turf. They herded the battered goblins toward the middle and piled them into a mass of writhing limbs. One ogre meandered to the ball. Nora growled, but Gretchen didn't write the green guys off. She waited, watching even as the others screeched at the ogres to pick up the pace, until the goblins broke free and swarmed ahead. Their speed caught the ogres off guard. One goblin snatched the ball while the others ran interference, darting every which way, their elbows out like they each had the ball. By the time it became clear which of them held the real deal, he was already halfway up the tree. The goblins on the ground pelted the ogres with smaller balls, whooping and jeering. Gretchen thought the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Then a chorus of drums sounded from across the stadium. Nora spun toward the sound with a murderous glare as the sound of the horn on the field announced the end of the match, just as the goblin emerged at the top of the tree. The referee held his arm toward the victorious ogres and bellowed, "Jitterball." "That's rigged," Nora screeched. Gretchen folded her arms and knew she'd be in for an evening of bitterness back at the Swine and Claw. Nora was a sore loser when it came to wagers, even though she could afford to lose a coin or two. The surrounding crowd swarmed toward the exit, some with triumphant grins and others with sour expressions, and the goblins slunk off the field while the ogres roared with victory. Gretchen was just happy she could finally go get that drink and puffed out her cheeks. There. Gretchen patted Nora's arm and stood. "This is why we should stick to potions and whatnot. Like Aunt Esme always used to say." "They cheated," Nora hissed. "Even so." Gretchen frowned, her eyes drawn to a small, cloaked figure who moved against the flow of foot traffic across the stands, like he was headed straight for them. Gretchen hoped it wasn't a bookkeeper or worse, looking for promised coin. "Come on, let's get out of here." "Not without a refund. The integrity of Jitterball depends on it. I've never seen the likes of." Gretchen clawed her friend's arm as the figure approached and nodded meaningfully. With clenched teeth, she whispered, "I think it's time to scram." Nora's eyebrows drew together, and she turned to stare at the approaching figure, who was close enough to be within earshot. "You'll not silence me, rogue. I can smell magical interference, you hear? I'll report this to the authorities." A chuckle sounded under the hood, and small knobby hands pushed back the cowl to reveal a face that ought to have cracked mirrors with a mere glance. Gretchen's face wrinkled as she tried to guess whether the guy was humanoid or some other supernatural. With crooked teeth and a nose that looked like it had been on the business end of a swinging shovel at some point, his grin did nothing to improve his appearance. But there was something about his almost yellow eyes that made Gretchen's mouth go dry. "You have a true sense of justice, Nora Brightstar." His voice was smooth, and he gave a mischievous wink. Manipulating luck is a grievous offense. "Here." He dug into a fold of his cloak and drew out a glimmering hourglass. "This trinket is imbued with the power to sense time slips. Crafted it myself an age ago. If it's retribution you want, it's retribution you shall have." Nora took the hourglass just as Gretchen opened her mouth to protest. The imp's eyes gleamed, and Gretchen reached to grab his robe. But it was too late. With a gnarled hand he clicked his fingers, and a great whooshing feeling pushed Gretchen down to the bench seat. Blinking a couple of times, Gretchen tried to reckon with what happened while reconciling with the sound of cheers erupting throughout the stadium. The ogres and goblins were jostling down on the field once more while the referee held up the ball, and Gretchen's mouth hung open as she stared at the blank scoreboard at the end of the field. She touched the pie beside her, which was the same lukewarm temperature it was when she bought it from a vendor at the start of the game. "What have you gone and done?" she hissed, tearing her eyes away from the field to stare at Nora, who sat dumbly holding the hourglass. "Do you have any idea who that guy was?" Nora shifted on the bench seat and flinched as the crowd roared over a brutal tackle Gretchen recalled from the start of the game. "Well, I suppose it was, but perhaps not, of course. That is to say, I recall some mention of a particular imp in some old texts in the library." "Nora Jean Brightstar," Gretchen snapped. "The folks sitting nearby didn't so much as look at the pair. Don't get cagey with me. You know as well as I do that you just brokered a deal with Larkspire the imp, the minor god of luck himself. And they say I'm the foolhardy one." Nora swallowed and turned the hourglass in her hand. "I suppose I did at that. I was just so angry, you see, and before I could think twice I was already holding the darn thing, and then once it clicked in my head, bam, we were back here." Gretchen rubbed the bridge of her nose and took a long breath to calm herself. Dealing with gods violated the witch's code, and while she rarely gave two figs for that kind of thing, she had no desire to end up in a world of trouble because she'd attracted the attention of a being capable of throwing misfortune at her for the rest of her days. Besides, she'd been in enough scrapes over the years to be thoroughly convinced that she'd used up all her good luck coupons, and at some point, the scales would tip the other way. The last thing she needed was to be stranded on some alternate timeline, or worse, stuck in a loop sitting through the same game of Jitterball for the rest of eternity. "I knew we should have just stayed at the Swine and Claw tonight. Where'd you say you got those tickets again?" "I didn't." Nora frowned. "In fact, I can't seem to recall where they came from." Gretchen groaned. "Great. This was all a setup. Now what are we supposed to do?" The crowd began jeering, and the hourglass shimmered, causing Nora to narrow her eyes at the field. "Just as he says. Someone is manipulating time to give the ogres the advantage. We must stop them." Nora rose from her seat, and Gretchen clung onto her sleeve. "You're joking, right? This was all some misunderstanding until now, but if we go poking around the stadium to do Larkspire's bidding, we're complicit." "That's it. Our witch license is revoked, my potion shop closed for good, and that sweet deal you've got with the Council Unhexing Antiques goes down the drain. Is a stupid game of Jitterball worth it?" Nora considered Gretchen with an amused twist to her lips. "Gretchen Mirkwood, you're sounding like an old fuddy-duddy. Since when have you been the type to turn down an adventure?" since I got my life in order, took on Piper was my ward, set up shop in the city. Gretchen counted on each finger and continued with, found out what happened to Aunt Esme, and finally have enough coin in my pouch to feed myself and my cat regularly. Nora guffawed, and Gretchen felt her cheeks warm. The people around them took no notice of their conversation amidst the din of the game, but Gretchen hastened to stand and shoo her friend across the stand and down the steps to where an alcove led to the stinking commodes underneath. Come on, Nora, even I never messed around with the gods, and immortals like Edgelada don't count. Sure, I've partaken of interdimensional voyages, dragons, taken on the landed gentry, ghosts, zombies, and even a plague of Krampuses for Pete's sake. But calling down the wrath of the gods on oneself? That's just crazy. Nora's jaw hung open. And what do you suppose will happen if we refuse to do his bidding, eh? Sounds pretty wrath-inducing to me. And unless you have some hidden talent for manipulating time that I wasn't aware of, it seems we have little choice in the matter. Gretchen rubbed her chin and considered the hourglass in Nora's grip. Choice? We always have a choice. Sure, Larkspire might be annoyed if we don't play ball, but even he must know that witches don't deal with his sort. Besides, it's a game of Jitterball. It's not like it's important or anything. I'll wager he's just trying to get the both of us in trouble. Nora drew a sharp breath through her nose and puffed herself up. Not important? Cheating? Gretchen refrained from grabbing her friend by the shoulders to give her a shake. This was all the wrong way around. Back in the days when Nora worked for the Baron of Greenhaven, this never would have happened. In fact, back then it was difficult to rouse Nora from her cups at the Salt and Bog at all. This new job with the Witches' Council had certainly left its mark on Nora, and while Gretchen had never seen her friend happier, her stubborn streak was still one of her greatest vices. Gretchen glanced at a crudely carved sign on a door which she surmised was a cleaning cupboard, and snatched Nora's pointed witch's hat from her head. Hey. Nora clamped a hand on her scalp. You want to roll the dice with the god of luck? Fine, but we do this smart. She pulled her own hat from her head and opened the door, revealing mops, buckets, and plungers. Tucking both hats away in the corner, she took 2 aprons from a hook and pulled her friend inside. You and I do this incognito, understand? As far as the newspapers are concerned in the morning, a couple of cleaners were responsible for uncovering a match-fixing plot and saving the good name of Jitterball for supporters across the lands. We never speak of it again. Not even a word. Just like the time we... Shush. Gretchen pressed a finger to Nora's mouth, then noticed a wayward spider crawling through her friend's iron-gray curls. After plucking it out and rehoming it on an accommodating overhead beam, she muttered, Geez, got anything else living in there? Nora snatched an apron from Gretchen and scowled. It's rude to ask what's underneath a witch's hat, but if you insist on being such a worrywart, I'll play along with the ruse. Nobody will hear this from me. You have my word. Gretchen narrowed her eyes as the witch pulled the rather short apron over her head and considered the likelihood of Nora keeping her trap shut at 2 in the morning after one too many witches' brews. I'll brew a memory wipe potion in the morning. You'll drink it, right? Nora scoffed and shook her head. Is that really necessary? Yes. Gretchen folded her arms. You know, I think I prefer the Gretchen who went herring off at a moment's notice on some silly quest with a distinct lack of self-preservation. I can't recall you enjoying it at the time. Perhaps not. You still haven't agreed to my terms. Nora sighed. In the morning I will drink your foul concoction to forget the events of this night. Happy? Gretchen smirked. Who said it would be foul? They're always foul, Nora groaned. Not bothering to reply, Gretchen pulled her own apron on and grabbed a bucket and mop before pressing them into Nora's hands. A raucous cry erupted from the crowd, causing dust to flutter from the rafters. A cleaner can get into most places, right? Where do you think these miscreants are holed up? If it's time they're meddling with, then there's a good chance whatever is happening is connected to the timekeeper's box. They're usually somewhere with a decent vantage so they can signal time easily to the referees. I imagine we will need to get through the club rooms. The officials wouldn't be sitting with the riff-raff. Of course not, Gretchen grunted as she grabbed a broomstick and stepped out of the cupboard. Nora peered at the glimmering hourglass and muttered something about a head tackle, then followed Gretchen down the worn steps from the very top of the stadium toward the entrance. Chapter 2. As Gretchen and Nora descended toward the entrance, they passed through dimly lit corridors lined with peeling posters and faded banners advertising past matches. The air grew heavy with the scent of sweat and spilled ale, mingling with the echoes of cheering crowds reverberating through the walls. Gretchen couldn't help but notice the worn edges of the walls, marked with graffiti and scuff marks from years of use. The atmosphere felt charged with anticipation, as if the very walls themselves held the echoes of past victories and defeats. Under the stands, food carts crowded around the ticketing booths, with crumpled ticket stumps littering the cobbles and an expectant air in the space while the game was in full swing. People and supernaturals alike pottered around, taking no heed of the sounds above, from dwarves tending meat smokers to humans checking baked potatoes in portable ovens. Gretchen peered around to locate the most likely employee to approach, and her stomach grumbled as the scent of roasting meat filled her nostrils. She had to remind herself that playing roulette with her digestive system wasn't worth the risk. They had to be smooth. One wrong move and Gretchen had no doubt they'd be thrown out on their rear ends by the mostly ogre security. "What do you think?" "The dwarf," Gretchen whispered as she elbowed her partner in crime. "Dwarves are loyal to a fault. No, if he thought he could throw us under the cart for his employer's favor, he would do it without hesitation. What about that girl over there?" Gretchen followed Nora's gaze to the ticketing booth, where a young woman stood with a sullen set to her mouth as she counted tickets. "Her? Didn't she stamp our tickets? She had some serious attitude." "Precisely. Look at her, she thinks the work is beneath her station. I'll wager she doesn't have a single friend among the staff." "And you think that'll make her helpful?" Gretchen snorted. "I'll bet she calls security the minute she smells something off." Nora strode off toward the booth with a careless, "Then we better play the part, huh?" over her shoulder. Gretchen cursed under her breath and hurried to catch up. She had a bad feeling about the girl, but it was too late to haul Nora back without attracting the notice of everyone working away at their posts. As they approached the booth, the girl looked up at them with an annoyed scowl. "Excuse me." Nora flashed her teeth in what she must have thought was a charming smile. "I hate to trouble you, but we were hoping you could help point us in the right direction. Nancy and I were called in last minute, and a steward told us we need to get to the club rooms right away to clean up blood or some such. But I'm afraid we haven't worked at this stadium before. I don't suppose you could." "Eddie called you in?" The girl gave them a frank stare. "Eddie never hires human cleaners. He insists on brownies for that kind of work." The last was said with a certain distaste, and Gretchen stepped closer. "Well, I mean, of course he does. The labor is cheaper, and he doesn't have to worry about paying penalty rates. You know how hard it is to get work as a human cleaner these days. I mean, look at these aprons. Hardly long enough to keep my skirts from getting muck all over them. And don't even get me started on the equipment. I'll be needing some strong salve for my poor back come morning with all this bending over just to get the mop right into the corners. But you know, coin is coin, so..." Nora brought her heel down on Gretchen's foot. "Don't mind her. Just a chatty Cathy, that one. But do you mind pointing us in the right direction?" The girl still looked like she had a bug up her backside, but took a deep breath and shrugged. "The pay isn't much better at the booth. Eddie suggested putting dwarves up here. Can you believe? I told him it would cause a riot among the patrons." Gretchen nodded with a solemn face, even if she was screaming a little on the inside. It was the pointy hat that had earned her the attitude on the way in. She figured Nora was right about one thing. This stuck-up little snot thought she was better than the supernatural dregs of society. Nora tittered. "This city is really going to the dogs. But I'm afraid if we don't get to the clubrooms soon, we might be thrown out before the night is through, so..." The girl gave them directions through a cordoned-off hallway and down a wide stairwell. It took a while for Gretchen's nose to twitch with the scent of goblins and ogres, but when they arrived at what must have been ground level, which was below even the city streets, an ogre, wider than any she'd seen playing on the field, stood with his arms folded at the door. He looked them up and down before baring his yellowed teeth in a grunt. "Who are you?" "The cleaners, my good man," Nora said. "I understand there's a mess that needs seeing to, so if you don't mind." The ogre didn't budge. "What happened to Yvette?" "Food poisoning," Gretchen piped up. Took too many leftovers home from those carts upstairs and paid dearly for it. Eddie just sent her home. Even a strong constitution can only take so much punishment, ya know. The ogre put a hand to his belly and made a face. I've done that one too many times before. Just mind yourselves in there. The officials don't take too kindly to the help. Best not to make eye contact. Gretchen gave the guy a pat on the shoulder on the way through and followed Nora into a common room with doors painted in blue and red on either side. But it wasn't the locker rooms they wanted, so Gretchen made as if she was sweeping some errant dust while Nora poked her head through another hallway. The room quaked as the sound of muffled cheering sounded above Gretchen's head, and Nora scurried into sight holding her sleeve over the mop bucket. It's happened again, she said, lifting the bucket meaningfully. There was no denying that there was a distinct glow around the edges of Nora's sleeve, brighter than the last one. Do you think it's just the proximity to whoever's behind all this, or the time slip itself was stronger? Hard to say, Nora chewed her lip. But I can recall at least 4 times during the game that the goblins had the advantage and time was called. That means there might only be another couple of chances to catch these people red-handed before the game is over. Gretchen caught sight of a man in a red vest with a thin mustache stalking into the room and ushered Nora behind a bar of sorts equipped with barrels of both water and ale. He scanned the room with eagle eyes and fixed them with a stony stare. You two. He clicked his fingers. The goblin locker room. Now, they carted a player off the field and the doc has been up to his elbows in blood putting everything back in place. Gretchen blinked. Perhaps human cleaners weren't that remarkable after all. She figured she could handle a little blood, so she nudged Nora with an elbow and went to tug at her absent witch's hat. Sure thing. Right away. You can count on us, sir. It was Nora's turn to elbow Gretchen into silence as the official frowned and strode off through the hallway Nora had been casing just minutes before. When the sound of his footfalls dwindled, Nora rounded on her. What do you call that? What do you mean? Sir? Since when does anyone call a person sir these days? Says the witch who worked for a my lord for the better part of a decade. But that's hardly the same. And in fairness, I only called him that when he needed coddling. Coddling? Of course. Every noble needs a good coddle from time to time. Otherwise, how would we ever get any meaningful decisions made? Gretchen made a face. You know, for a progressive type, you have some strange predilections for tradition. Nora opened her mouth to argue, then clicked her teeth shut with a low growl. We don't have time for this. Come on, let's go find these timekeepers. But don't we have to clean up some goblin blood? Nora's face twisted in indignation, and her fist clenched around the mop handle. We're not really cleaners, Gretchen. Gretchen tapped the side of her nose. Ah. But said goblin might have some useful information about the case, you see. Going by that hourglass of yours, he might have been taken off the field around the time that the last time slip happened. We could question him. Nora scoffed, then her eyebrows knitted together like she was considering the suggestion. I suppose we can't go herring off in the direction that fellow went just yet, can we? Gretchen grunted an affirmative, then made for the door painted blue on account of remembering the colored armbands each team wore when she sat through the game the first time. There were several stretcher incidents while she sat in the nosebleeds, and none had involved ogres being hauled off the pitch as far as she could recall. She might have nodded off for a few minutes during the second half, but she was certain a serious injury would have caused enough uproar to wake her. Opening the door itself was a test in intestinal fortitude as the stench of goblin hit them like a miasma. But Gretchen took it as a good sign that Yvette the brownie wasn't lurking around, ready to expose them as frauds the minute she spotted them. She whispered as much to Nora as they picked their way across a sticky floor littered with boots, bags, and discarded towels. I wouldn't count on her being gone too long. I expect a brownie could make their way around a place like this within the course of a jitterball game, however foul. And if she appears at the entrance, our ogre friend will come looking for us. Gretchen leaned her broom against a wall and went poking around corners long enough to find a drawn curtain with the sound of muffled moaning coming from within. The doctor must have left his patient to recover from whatever patch-up job he'd performed, because when she stuck her head through the curtain, the prone goblin on the cot was all she saw. Until the ball of presumably rags in the corner straightened itself upward, and Gretchen laid eyes on the oldest goblin she'd ever seen, and she decided by the floral pattern on the dress it wore that she was female. The ancient goblin's skin held only the barest hint of green, deep wrinkles lined even her scalp, and she held up a walking stick with a fierce hiss. "Leave now, Sawbones." She brandished her walking stick toward the curtain, and Gretchen noted the cloth in her other hand soaked with green goblin blood. "You make worse." "Whoa. Listen, lady, I'm no doctor, but I can sympathize." Gretchen held up her hands, then pointed to her face. "Me sympathize. Sawbones no good." By then Nora had bustled up behind her, and the goblin waved the walking stick with menace, until Gretchen stood back and held out an arm to keep Nora from pushing through. "We can help. I know magic healing." Nora choked indignantly, and Gretchen brought her heel down on her friend's boot to keep her from protesting. "So much for incognito," Nora muttered. The goblin glanced between them suspiciously, her face contorted even further as she considered or deciphered Gretchen's words. Luckily, witches had or no, Gretchen kept a healthy supply of small potions on her person at all times. It had taken a fair bit of needlework to add a bunch of extra pockets in her usual drab dress after losing her infinity pouch, but it paid to be prepared, even if she did have a tendency to rattle rather than walk down a street. A general heal-all potion would take longer to yield results than she wagered Mama Goblin had in patience, but something to help with the pain could earn them enough trust to get the goblins answering questions. After drawing a small blue bottle in the third pocket on the left slowly, she proffered it with an anxious smile. She held her breath as she waited for the goblin matriarch to make her decision. But after she cast a worried frown at the player on the cot, whose face wore a sheen of sweat and a pained look, even with eyes closed, she evidently made up her mind. With faster reflexes than she ought to have, in Gretchen's opinion, she dove forward to snatch the bottle from Gretchen's grasp and hurried back to the corner where she uncorked it and took a tentative whiff. "Magic?" Gretchen nodded enthusiastically. "Magic potion. It'll help." The goblin dabbed a drop on her pinky finger before sticking it in her mouth. After swishing it around like a fine vintage, she spat into the corner with a faint look of distaste around her mouth before flashing a wide, toothy, or in this case stumpy grin. "Is strong. I give to Zeebo." "Zeebo, eh?" Gretchen took a step closer and thumped her chest. Nancy. This here is, Chatty Cathy. You are?" Nora squeaked behind her, but the goblin looked up from where she crouched beside the cot and pressed her hands together. "Nancy and Chatty Cathy. Me Anya. Greatest grandmother and manager of the Shadow Streakers." Gretchen mimicked Anya's gesture and crouched on the other side of the cot. "We're hoping you and Zeebo can help us, Anya. We," Gretchen swiveled and pointed between herself and Nora, "think there are people who are cheating to make sure your team lose the game." Anya frowned as she coaxed Zeebo to drink the potion as though she had to think carefully on every word. "Cheating?" "Yes, cheating," Nora said. "Using magic to interfere with the time." She pulled out her pocket watch and tapped it meaningfully. Anya watched Zeebo thoughtfully and laid a protective hand over his chest. "Bad man ask Anya to tell team to lose. Anya tell him to shove it up his breeches." "You don't say?" Gretchen threw a smug look back at Nora. "Breeches aside, I don't think he gave up on the idea, Anya. So how about you help us figure out who this bad man is and how to put a stop to this interference before anyone else gets hurt?" The aged goblin narrowed her eyes and balled her fist over her charge's prone body. "Bad man's breeches will need much mending when I find him." Chapter 3. Nora used her ample hips to bump past Gretchen and squat beside the elderly goblin, her eyes agleam. Yes, but we shall need more information. What did he look like? Could you point him out if you saw him again?" Anya made a face. "You humans look the same. But maybe I see the evil in this one's eyes when confronting him." "They say the eyes are portals to one's soul." "Yes." Nora rolled her eyes surreptitiously at Gretchen. "Where did you meet with this fella then?" Anya gave Zeebo's chest a pat, then stood with a grunt. "Jitterball Fields outside of city walls is where bad men visit Anya to provide match schedule. Maybe 3 suns ago." "An official then?" Gretchen nodded encouragingly. "You ever see him before?" Anya waved a hand in irritation. "Maybe. Maybe not. I speak with many humans as greatest grandmother of the Shadow Streakers. This one I shake my stick at and promise goblins win mighty victory this night. Fat stupid ogres are inferior to vigorous goblins. Of course, Nora crooned, taking Anya's elbow. You shall be our witness then. As greatest grandmother, I suppose you have the authority to visit the timekeeper rooms to watch the game? If it's time that's being meddled with, then I'll wager that room is the source of this treachery. Gretchen dragged a hand over her face, picturing Anya bursting into the room wielding her walking stick while decrying everyone in sight as a cheat. It was hardly the low-key sleuthing she had in mind, and she figured that whoever approached the greatest grandmother would be sensible enough not to be caught red-handed at the game itself. There were more threads that needed picking at, so she held up her hands to stop Nora bustling the elderly goblin out the door. Perhaps, Chatty Cathy, we need to do a little more investigating first, huh? Get a little more proof before bringing our star witness forward to provide evidence, so to speak. Nora scowled at the invented name Gretchen had bequeathed her but stopped. We don't have time to mess about if we are to get to the bottom of this before the game is finished, Nancy. We're still in the first quarter, Gretchen scoffed. That gives us plenty of time to do a little snooping first. I'd hate to mess this up and start all over again, if you catch my drift? Nora lifted a hand to chew on a nail absently, and Anya removed her arm from the crook of the witch's elbow to lean forward and examine her patient. With her weathered face bearing the marks of age and wisdom in equal measure, she inspected Zibo with a careful eye, her walking stick clutched firmly in her hand. Her presence exuded a sense of authority, despite her hunched form. Zibo breathing better. I return to sideline and watch goblins defeat ogres while you. She paused, as if searching for the word. Investigate. But if more of my grandsons are hurt, I call off match and tell them cheating. Nora winced, and Gretchen recalled a nasty blow that came later in the game. Perhaps they had less time than they thought to remedy the situation. Even as for what passed as a team manager, she doubted that Anya's claims would be taken seriously, and even less faith that Larkspire would be satisfied with a forfeited match. But they had more information than they did when entering the goblin locker room, so Gretchen nodded with a gracious smile as Anya shuffled past her. Just remember, Nora called. We must keep this discreet until we can reveal with absolute certainty who is behind this. Anya only grunted and waved her walking stick as she left the locker room, and Gretchen tapped her chin thoughtfully. So, it sounds like this seedy business involves more than just the folks watching the clock, then? It could be the entire outfit running this stadium. Or, Nora said, it could be the ogres who have oiled the right hands to ensure their victory, or the bookkeepers making sure their purses stay heavier than your average punter. Perhaps even someone in the crowd with the right connections who has a substantial wager on the line. I mean, if we really examine this from all angles, it could be another team entirely who are trying to ensure they have the best chances of winning against the victor. Gretchen's mouth twisted in a wry smile. You know, I think this new job of yours is rubbing off on you. That, or hex witches are scheming types best suited to putting themselves in the shoes of criminals. Nora spluttered in indignation. Scheming, eh? Better that than running off half-cocked with false convictions based on whatever thought bubble bursts the quickest inside your empty head. Me? Gretchen pointed to her chest in feigned shock. I think your sense is only starting to catch up with you, Nora Brightstar. Or don't you remember snatching that hourglass faster than Jurgen can hurl a bad-tempered gnome out of the salt and bog? Nora's cheeks flushed, and annoyance replaced indignation on her features. Fine. Let's not waste time squabbling and get to work. We have Anya to corroborate that she was approached by an official for match fixing, which she refused. Now we need to find where these time slips are originating from so we can discover who is behind them. My bet is a wizard. Gretchen fell into step beside Nora as they left Zibo sleeping on his cot. In fact, I'd almost say that this whole charade was worth it if we discredited the Wizards Guild in the process. Except we won't remember, will we? After you insisted on the memory wipe brew? Gretchen puffed out her cheeks. It seemed her earlier reticence was peeling away as the case progressed, and stubbornness in much smaller quantities than Nora's abundant supply kept her from eating her words. She was living a sensible life these days, it was true, but she couldn't help relishing the bubbles of excitement brewing in her belly. Some habits died harder than others. But she had made enough mistakes over the past few years to approach the situation with a generous side serve of caution, and even if she only got to enjoy the downfall of a deceitful wizard for one night, She was sure it would still count as a point on the board in the cosmic struggle between witch and wizard kind. Just being sensible is all. Gretchen peered into the room they'd left earlier to check if the coast was clear, picked up her ordinary cleaner's broom, and pressed a mop into Nora's hands. A rumbling from above, accompanied by the roar of the crowd, caused dust to drift down from the rafters in the empty room. What next, then? Should we find an office to look at records or something? Perhaps, said Nora, though I shouldn't think it likely that there's a detailed manifesto from the culprit in there. I say let's just follow our noses and stay out of sight. Ah, that old chestnut. Always worked out for me just fine. Nora tutted and took Gretchen by the elbow to hurry into the hallway leading deeper into the stadium. It felt utilitarian, with bare timber floors and scuffed walls that might have been painted green at some point, and doors spaced far enough apart to indicate they were offices of some kind. There wasn't a single window in sight, or helpful signpost to let folks know where it led, but at the end, the hallway turned into a stairwell which led both up and down. Down would be directly to the sidelines, Nora muttered. But I should think the timekeepers would need some sort of vantage to observe from. Up, I think. You sure you don't want to try some of those doors back there? Gretchen jerked a thumb over her shoulder. Just in case? Nora pulled the hourglass from her mop bucket and frowned at the sands falling to the bottom. We might not have enough time. The players themselves can access that hallway, so I doubt there will be anything sensitive kept within their reach. But I suspect that nobody goes up there without an invitation. Well, I doubt cleaners are invited anywhere, but everyone expects the place to be spick and span anyhow. Gretchen started climbing the stairs with a sigh. I sure wish this was my actual broomstick, though. I've got a feeling we might need an escape plan before too long. Hush, Nora poked Gretchen in the small of her back with the mop handle as she followed. You'll have us discovered before we make it up these stairs at the rate you're yammering. Gretchen grinned and climbed the rest of the stairs in silence, which turned several times as they ascended. When she caught sight of the wide glass window at the top of the stairs, she halted and held a hand up in warning. Nora's wheezing behind her was liable to wake a comatose troll, and she heard the faint sound of voices above. You remember that time you shrunk me into a mouse frog in the Palace of Sharon? Gretchen whispered. I think we could use something like that right about now. Behind Gretchen, Nora sucked in deep breaths and didn't reply right away. I thought you said you'd never allow me to perform any kind of magic on you again after that? I might have been a little hasty. Gretchen made a face. Being a fly on the wall would be pretty useful given the circumstances. Well, as I'm sure you recall, we used a potion for that particular spell, so unless you have one rattling away in one of your pockets. Nope. Gretchen bit her lip. It's times like these that I wish I had my infinity pouch back. Come, Nora said and poked her ribs. We're cleaners, remember? If we get shooed out, we'll simply have to think of something else. Gretchen sighed and willed her shoulders to slacken as she climbed the remaining steps, brandishing her ordinary broom like it was a VIP ticket. The window at the top of the stairwell only widened as she got closer, spanning across the entire room to provide the best view in the house. A velvet curtain hung over a lone doorway, and she twitched it aside to peer in. Plump sofas faced the window, with a group of overstuffed men in fine attire sprawling on them while sipping wine. The room exuded an air of opulence, only marred by the cigar smoke lingering in the air. A man with a thin mustache wearing an official's vest stood at the back of the room in front of what must have been a fancier entrance. The very same fella they'd encountered earlier. Gretchen bit back a curse as she spotted a door on the other side of the room. Looks like a lounge for the fancy folk, she whispered. Gretchen took a step back so Nora could see for herself, puzzling over their next steps. The Baron of Summerglen is in there, Nora squeaked, and Lord Benton. Both are notorious gamblers. Our Baron always said it was a wonder that they hadn't lost their fortunes entirely at the rate they placed wagers. Gretchen frowned. She never took much notice of the big folks in the city, and certainly couldn't point out anyone less important than King Edgar in a crowd. But Nora's long-standing job with the Baron of Greenhaven meant she had more dirt on the gentry tucked away in her noggin than the entire Witches' Academy combined, who were steeped in kingdom politics. But if this match-fixing conspiracy went that high up the totem pole, Gretchen figured there wasn't anything two witches could do about it. She whispered as much to Nora, who appeared to be too caught up in her own ruminations to listen. Yes, I suppose that's. She blinked and scowled at Gretchen, then tugged her to a corner away from the curtain. Are you really suggesting that there are those above the law? They're like cats, Gretchen scoffed. All that preening and expecting us all to run around for them, and they always land on their darn feet. Even so, Nora said and lifted her chin, I'm a witch of some standing, you know, and with the proper evidence. Gretchen hesitated, glancing nervously at the curtain and the VIP lounge beyond. The prospect of confronting the wealthy and powerful sent a shiver down her spine, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Hold on. Gretchen lifted a finger. You agreed that we're cleaners tonight. Nobody need ever know that we were involved in this for the sake of our witches' licenses being revoked. If the Academy ever found out about Larkspire, we'd be done for. Says she who started handing out magic potions the minute she could. Nora snapped. And who would ever tell them, huh? I can't recall the council ever keeping company with gods to prattle on about who did a deal with whom. Gretchen scrubbed a hand over her face. We don't even know if they're complicit yet. We can argue later. For now, we need to figure out how to get to that door on the other side of those big knobs. A sense of tension hung in the air as Gretchen and Nora peered at the curtain, the weight of their next decision pressing down on them like a heavy cloak. Nora pursed her lips and turned her attention back to Gretchen. I don't suppose you do have any useful potions on your person? Unless we want to treat those guys for fleas or a head cold, I've got nothing. Nora's eyes narrowed in calculation. Zebo. The goblin? I doubt he'd be any more welcome in there than we are. Most assuredly. But that steward asked us specifically to see to him. If we can draw him out under false pretenses, then one of us can stay behind to get to the other side of that room. Gretchen nodded appreciatively. It was better than anything she could think of given the circumstances. Barons and lords probably never even noticed the people tasked with sweeping up around them. It was likely bred into them, unlike the eagle eyes of the steward. And when he figures out that it was a ruse... Hopefully we have some answers by then. Nora shrugged. Unless you have a sleeping tincture somewhere that'll keep him out of the way for a few hours? Afraid not. I've been meaning to brew a fresh batch for weeks now. Never mind. Nothing that a well-placed knock to the head can't take care of. Nora Jean Brightstar. Gretchen hissed. You expect me to go thumping people? I'm a healer for Pete's sake. Huh? No, not at all. I'll do it. Nora pressed the mop bucket into Gretchen's hands and nodded at the hourglass stashed inside. I'll leave this in your safekeeping, just in case. Besides, you might need it to establish the source of the time slips when you get inside that room. Gretchen opened her mouth to protest, but Nora had already turned on her heel to march toward the curtain, mop in hand. Cursing under her breath, Gretchen cast around for any likely hiding place so she could stay out of sight. But unless she went downstairs again, there was nothing that would conceal her presence except for the curtain itself, so she scurried over and stepped into a dusty fold, trying to make herself as small as possible. What are you doing up here? Oh, forgive me, but I thought I should fetch you right away, you see. The goblin player has taken a nasty turn, and that old goblin Biddy is threatening to call off the match unless she speaks with you right away, so... Enough, the steward snapped. Take me to her this instant. Gretchen took a deep breath and huddled further into the recesses of the curtain as footsteps drew near, hugging the mop bucket close and praying nobody bumped into her. But the curtain only swished around her as they passed through, and Gretchen counted their footfalls on the steps until they were a faint echo. Sidestepping from the curtain's fold with a wicked nose itch threatening to send her into a fit of sneezes, Gretchen stashed the bucket in a corner and tucked the hourglass in one of her larger pockets. Right, just a little old lady doing the rounds with her broom to make sure these fine folks don't slip and break their delicate ankles, Gretchen muttered. I got this. But when she brushed past the curtain, the first thing that Gretchen did was sneeze, rather loudly. Chapter 4. Ooh, excuse me, gentlemen. Gretchen bobbed into something resembling a curtsy while reaching for the brim on her absent hat. Every puffy and pasty face in the room had turned toward her. Don't mind me. Just here to take care of domestic matters, if you know what I mean. You won't even know I'm here." The one that Nora had named Lord Benton sneered and took a sip of wine before averting his eyes from someone he probably considered as well beneath his station, and the Baron of Summerglen sniffed at a kerchief as he rolled his eyes. "Rather unsavory," the Baron said to another man next to him. "Though I shouldn't expect much from an establishment such as this." Gretchen felt her cheeks warm, but she scuttled crabwise against the wall to get to the back of the room and out of their view. At least nobody had roared at her to get out, so she was happy to take that as tacit agreement to her presence. Pushing her broom absently across the polished floor, she peered down a much better appointed set of stairs where the steward had stationed himself, though the carpeted floors and recently painted walls didn't yield any clues about what else might have been down there. But a static feeling at her fingertips caused Gretchen to stare at the door on the other side of the lounge. Magic. She was certain of it. The floor rumbled, and the stadium reverberated with the sound of the crowd, causing the gaudy chandelier in the room to jingle and Gretchen to flinch. The men in the room either tutted or whistled, and Gretchen peered circumspectly into her pocket to check the hourglass. There was no glimmering to indicate a time slip, so she took a calming breath and put it down to a regular goal on either end of the field below. She figured whoever was inside the timekeeper's room was likely at their most distracted right about then, so she hustled to the door with her hand outstretched, despite the tingling of her fingers turning to crackling. When she clasped the door handle, an electric shock snaked up her arm, and a whooshing feeling threw her backward. She gritted her teeth and closed her eyes, sure she'd just blown her cover, but when she opened them, she was standing behind the velvet curtain again. What in light's name? Gretchen twitched aside the curtain and stared at the gentry sitting there like nothing had happened. Then she went to pull the hourglass from her pocket, but fumbled the magical item as she realized the contraption was red hot. Hoping that it wouldn't scorch her skirts, she stared through the window trying to piece together what had happened. By the arrangements of the players on the field with a goblin screaming away from a pack of ogres toward the scoring end, she would have bet that they were about to get a goal. Was that a time slip? Gretchen frowned at the velvet curtain. Then she stepped in a second time, sans the sneezing. This time, none of the fops glanced her way. Stepping cautiously, she followed her earlier route around the back of the room and winced at the familiar static feeling building in her fingertips. By the time she reached for the door handle again, Gretchen had braced herself for the pain, and as expected, an electrical current sent her flying backward. Shaking her smarting arm, Gretchen sucked in sharp breaths and glared at the curtain once again. "By the whiskers of 1,000 cats," she hissed, sticking a finger in her mouth to soothe the burn. By the warming of her skirts, she didn't have to look at the hourglass to know it was in the same state as it was before. And a quick glance at the field showed the goblin tearing off down the field in the same fashion as he had moments ago. But if it was a time slip, why was she inside it rather than the passive observer she had been when she watched it the first time? It was that darn door, and she had a mind to let it know who was who. This time, Gretchen flung the velvet curtain open and stomped directly through the gasping idiots on the sofas, her face murderous. She didn't listen to their protests and snarled as she reached the door. "Show you to throw a witch around like that. I'll tear you into splinters." Gretchen pushed up her sleeves and reached deep within to channel her ire in raw magic. It was foolhardy, and likely an explosive endeavor, but she pushed the magic down through her extremities right to her fingertips like a skin-tight suit of armor. But it was all for naught as she was thrown back again with zinging pain coursing through her entire body. Except this time, she stifled a whimper as she realized she was clinging to the mop bucket in the curtain again. "Take me to her this instant." Gretchen held her breath as Nora and the steward went past her again and glared at the hourglass in the bucket which was rapidly heating the conductive tin. Not bothering to count their footfalls this time, Gretchen hastily dumped the bucket in the same corner she had previously and gave her limbs a shake to be rid of the lingering static energy. The door was evidently well protected by whatever magic was involved in these shenanigans, and Gretchen grimaced as she realized she was the wrong witch for the job of getting past it. Nora was the one out there unhexing things these days, having a knack for enchantments that Gretchen wasn't too proud to say wasn't her forte. Corrosive potions to melt off door handles, sure, but messing with another person's magic was treacherous work. She rubbed her chin and considered her options. If she could have a do-over, it only made sense that Nora stayed behind while Gretchen took the steward off on some wild goose chase. Goose chases she could handle. In fact, it was probably in her top 3 strengths if her recent adventures were anything to go by. But the only way to achieve that was to march back through the curtain and somehow get the door to propel her even further back in time. With her hot head rapidly cooling, Gretchen figured that messing with the door any further might lead to unintended consequences, and as it stood, the enchantment was another piece of evidence in the match-fixing scandal. Better to get all the pieces of the puzzle together and provide it to whoever had the authority around here to apprehend the culprits. Chewing her lip, she decided that the best course of action would be to follow Nora and keep her appraised of events. Besides, if she was planning on assaulting the steward, she could probably use some backup. Taking a spare handkerchief from her pocket, Gretchen bent to fish the hourglass out of the bucket and wrapped it as best she could to keep the heat emanating from the magical device from burning anything important. Then she grabbed her broom and headed down the stairs. Mindful that the pair were likely still making their way to the locker room, Gretchen poked her head around each corner and tiptoed through the hallway lest she catch up to them too soon. And when she arrived at the room leading to the goblin's quarters, she halted to cast a wary eye around the space. Ah, crap. Gretchen grimaced as she spotted an unwelcome sight approaching from the next hallway, then hastened to dive behind a barrel. A pint-sized brownie clad in a cleaner's apron brandished a broom not unlike the one Gretchen held, and whistled cheerily as she made steady progress toward her. Yvette. Of course she turns up now, Gretchen mused. And that meant the ogre's security guard was likely scratching his head at that very moment, trying to decide whether the old ladies who had passed him earlier were a threat that needed seeing to, or if there had been some misunderstanding. Gretchen couldn't decide which one was worse. If the ogre left his post to find a superior to check in with, he might very well interrupt Nora braining the steward in the locker room. Dragging a hand over her face, Gretchen waited as the seconds dragged on for Yvette to make her way past to the hallway Gretchen had just emerged from. Then more foot traffic kept her from moving, and by the heavy footfalls it sounded very much like an ogre. Gretchen risked a glance from the other side of the barrels, expecting the security guard, but it was another ogre who entered the room, this one gray with a silver beard you rarely saw among their species. He wore a finer jacket than she was accustomed to seeing among their ilk, and to her surprise, passed by the ogre locker rooms to stride through the goblin's blue door. Things were going from bad to worse. Gretchen took a deep breath and emerged to follow him, gripping her broom like a weapon despite knowing that a sound thump to the head with something as flimsy as a broom handle was only likely to irritate an ogre. Great, she muttered under her breath as she caught the door before it snapped shut. This is just great. When she slipped inside, she pressed herself against the wall behind the door and bent her ear to the voices sounding deeper into the locker room. Tried to whack me with a bat. You said this arrangement was airtight, Marcus. It is. I don't know who this woman is. I can only assume she's working for Anya. Where is that old bat? I came down here to find her. There was a pause. She's not on the sidelines? I figured she was up here seeing to that grandkid of hers. Gretchen moved from the doorway to the open locker area and snuck to the shower stalls to hide behind a leather curtain. The smell was indescribable, perhaps even Yvette drew the line somewhere when it came to cleaning, but her new position afforded her a view around the corner to where she'd found Zebo and Anya. Nora sat tied to a chair with what looked like a long striped sock used as a gag around her mouth. The steward Marcus, and who she figured must have been the ogre team manager, considered the witch, and Gretchen rubbed her temples as she tried to think quick. Anya was apparently AWOL, and their cover was blown. She knew that the questioning would begin sooner rather than later, and while she was sure Nora would at least appreciate having that sock removed from her mouth, Gretchen couldn't watch as her friend was harmed. She needed to get them out of the room. She needed a distraction. Too much gold is resting on this, Marcus. The ogre shoved a meaty finger under the steward's nose. You'll be the one to take the fall if this goes sour, you hear. And if those toffs end up collecting my winnings from the bookies, you'll pay for it in blood. I told you that Goblin Hag wouldn't fall into line. Marcus trembled and smoothed a hand over his thin mustache. Gretchen cast around frantically for something that would divert their attention, preferably to the other side of the darn stadium. Then something unexpected happened. From behind the curtain where they'd first found Anya, Zebo launched past with a yodeling cry, swinging a jitterball bat in a frenzy. The injured goblin brained Marcus first, but when the bat connected with the ogre, it snapped in half, leaving the ogre to bare his tusks in a wicked grin. Marcus slumped, evidently unconscious, but the ogre took a step toward the goblin, who appeared to realize his error rather quickly. When the ogre delivered a brutal blow to Zeebo's head, Gretchen winced as the already battered goblin collapsed against a wall. Nora squeaked around her gag, which snapped Gretchen back to the matter at hand. Reaching to hastily untie one of her boots, she pulled it off and stuck an arm from behind the curtain to pitch it toward the door, where it connected with a resounding thud. The ogre's head snapped toward the sound, his hulking frame tense. Then he stalked toward the door, and Gretchen slid from her hiding place, her mind racing as she tried to reckon with what she should do next. A discarded boot wasn't going to keep him away for long, but the sound must have drawn a passerby's attention, because Gretchen had to launch toward an empty locker as the blue door swung open. Her eyes connected with Nora's for a second before she folded herself inside the cramped space. The louvers on the door afforded her a crack in which to see what was going on. "Mr. Onk, sir?" The gravelly voice belonged to no other than the ogre security guard they'd passed earlier. "Everything okay in here?" Brack. The team manager bent to pick up Gretchen's discarded boot with a puzzled frown. "We seem to have a security problem in here. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" "Seems this old lady back here has found some way in," he said, and leered at the ogre accusingly. "She assaulted Marcus and one of the goblin players. It was lucky I got here when I did. Be a good lad and stand watch while I sort this out. Nobody goes in or out until I get back, you understand?" Brack swallowed and nodded a little frantically. "Of course, Mr. Onk. On my honor." Onk sneered and frowned again at the boot in his hand. "Keep a close eye. I know a witch when I smell one, and this one is the crafty sort. But witches can't do magic when they're unconscious, if you know what I mean." Gretchen winced as Brack muttered affirmatives, then Onk left the room still clutching Gretchen's boot. She had little opportunity to dwell on the loss of stout and comfortable footwear which had been a present to herself just a few months back, because when the door snapped closed with an ominous echo across the room, Brack turned his attention to Nora, and his mean expression implied that he meant business. Chapter 5. "A witch, huh?" Brack's heavy footsteps echoed through the locker room as he approached, his massive frame casting a menacing shadow. With a sinister gleam in his eye, he smacked his meaty fist into his palm, a predatory grin spreading across his ugly mug. "Should have figured something was off when you and your friend showed up earlier. I'll bet you put me under a spell or something." His eyes gleamed as though he had just come up with a terrific idea. "Yeah, that's it. A spell. In fact, I can't even remember two old birds passing my post at all. But where's your friend now, huh?" Brack loomed over the chair, and Nora only glared up at his ugly mug. "Mr. Onk says I should turn the lights off so you can't go throwing magic around again. That'd give me plenty of time to round up the skinny one and show him I'm the ogre for the job." He pounded his fist into his palm again. "But my mother always told me not to hit girls when I was a pup. So, you'll behave, yeah? And when I take that gag off, you'll tell me where she is." "Umph," Nora grunted from around the sock. "I'll take that as a yes." Gretchen's mind raced as she weighed her options, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had to act fast, but the right course of action eluded her as she imagined Nora being assaulted. Busting out of the locker armed with nothing more than wit and an element of surprise would only do her good for a matter of seconds. Clasping her skirts to do a mental stock take of the potions secreted around her person, she cursed herself for the umpteenth time for not being better prepared. Sure, she mostly traded in healing potions and brews that solved common household concerns these days, but she'd been backed into a corner one too many times and should have learned by now that it paid to be prepared. Ogres. What were their vulnerabilities? Did they even have vulnerabilities? She'd seen firsthand what they were prepared to eat at the Swine and Claw, which made them damn near impervious in her estimation. Something to take him down quickly and quietly before Nora began mouthing off at him. Her hand fumbled at the second row of pockets on the right, and inspiration struck. The brews on that side were mostly distilled with alcohol, and with a little something extra, she could turn one of them into something that would take out an elephant if applied correctly. "I say," Nora shrilled. "No need to be so rough. Did your mother tell you not to wrench a girl's head from her neck too?" Tell me everything, witch. Or I'll need to beg my mother's forgiveness for what I'll do next." Gretchen took a deep breath and eased out of her hiding place. Brack loomed over Nora, but the angle allowed Gretchen to press her finger against her mouth in warning to her friend. Nora's eyes widened as she spotted her, but she swung her head the other way and moaned pathetically before Brack had a chance to follow her gaze. Now, just to keep from tripping over anything and drawing attention to herself, Gretchen mused. Her earlier observations of the cleanliness of the locker rooms notwithstanding, she was sure there must be some bleach lying around somewhere. It only stood to reason that it was the only suitable solution which stood a chance of cutting through the grime of an entire team's worth of Jitterball players, whatever their respective species, so long as Nora could keep the ogre talking until then. "He lied, you know," Nora whined. "It was that steward that knocked me over the head and tied me up like this, and the despicable ogre has left poor Zebo in such a state. Be a good chap and check that he's breathing, won't you? I shouldn't like to see what happens if you're discovered in this room with a dead player. My, that would make quite the splash on the front page of tomorrow's newspaper. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that people like this Mr. Onk never take the blame for this kind of—" "Shut up," Brack growled. "Filthy lies. You won't talk about Mr. Onk like that. You're just trying to save your own skin." Gretchen crept around the corner to follow the row of shower stalls to the back, casting around for a cleaner's cupboard. She held an alcoholic potion to treat warts firmly in her hand and reminded herself not to crack the fragile glass. "Is that so? You look like a clever ogre, Brack. Look at him. That egg on his head is turning purple. You think a feeble old woman such as myself could possibly be capable of such a blow?" "A witch, you mean? I wouldn't put it past any of your sort. A bit of mumbo-jumbo and waggling fingers and anything could happen." "Now, dear, I'm sure even you don't believe such nonsense. If that were true, we witches would be better stationed in life. I know it's difficult to believe such treachery about someone you clearly admire, but the truth of it is that we are here investigating a match-fixing plot, and it seems your Mr. Onk is complicit. Even now he's probably off hunting the goblin's greatest grandmother. She was staunch in refusing to lose the game, you know. I fear for her safety. Now be a good ogre and—" "Enough," Brack bellowed. "Mr. Onk would never cheat. Everyone knows the Thunderhawks are the best team in the league. Those pathetic shadow streakers never stood a chance." Gretchen poked around at the end of the row of shower stalls, silently cursing her friend. Winding the ogre up didn't seem like such a good idea given her current predicament, and there was no sign of a cupboard with the cleaning supplies Gretchen sought. But when she twitched aside the leather curtain on the last stall, her shoulders sagged in relief as she spotted a high shelf with a scrubbing brush and 2 corked earthenware jugs above the showerhead. They were just out of reach, though, so she had to track back to find an accommodating something to stand on. "Perhaps you need to ask yourself a question, Brack. Why are the Thunderhawks doing so well this year, huh? I remember just last season they were struggling to win a single game. Sure, the Goblin team is a recent addition, but you must admit that it seems a little fishy." "That's easy. Mr. Onk has turned the club around. We needed discipline and better strategies. I've watched every single training session this year, and I can tell you that things have changed since the person who is fixing matches began managing the team." Nora interrupted. "Think, Brack. You're clearly a fan, I admire that, but surely the integrity of the game is more important than winning." Gretchen had to cross the floor behind the pair to fetch a wooden crate, praying that the ogre didn't turn at an inopportune moment. She took the chance to wave her hand to encourage Nora to continue. As she trotted back silently to the shower stall with her prize, Nora continued her wheedling. "I know this must be difficult. Finding honest work as a supernatural in this city is no mean feat, and I would hazard a guess that working at the stadium is something of a dream job, yes? But imagine for a moment that what I am telling you is true. You're part of it now. And when Mr. Onk's plot is discovered, it'll be back to the tannery for you. I don't suppose you'd enjoy being covered in muck and stench for the rest of your days. You'll be lucky if you aren't banned from the stadium for life, and that's the truth of it." Gretchen overturned the crate into the shower stall and winced as it scraped against the gritty floor. She stood frozen, her heart thumping as she waited for the ogre's heavy footfalls to start heading her way, but jumped into action as she climbed the crate, determined to get this concoction mixed before it was too late. It can't be true, Brack insisted, clearly too caught up in his own dilemma to notice the sound. Mr. Marcus here was telling those VIPs that the goblins would win earlier. Everyone knows they get the good tips. Aha! Gretchen could feel the smugness wafting off her friend as she uncorked a jug and sniffed at the bleach inside. Now to mix it in the right quantities without setting off a disastrous chemical reaction. Though at the rate Nora was going, Gretchen wondered if she would need the brew by the time it was ready. What's that supposed to mean? Oh, come now. A bright lad such as yourself knows that your average bookkeeper only accepts wagers that won't bankrupt them if it doesn't go their way. I'd say it would take quite a lot of coin from the gentry already in their pockets to convince them to accept a substantial wager on the Thunderhulks. I should think that sort of bet would turn out well for everyone except those men upstairs. Goodness knows they can afford to lose that much gold in the course of a single evening. Gretchen held the jug steady under her arm, her teeth set as she counted every drop falling into the bottle. No, it was almost a plea on Brack's part. You're lying. A small puff of smoke accompanied an acrid stench wafting from the potion bottle, and Gretchen eased the jug up and set the potion aside so she could quickly get the bleach corked and back on the shelf. There was always a chance that the potion's original purpose might give the chloroform some unintended side effects, but she hoped it would do its job quickly and efficiently, or else there was a good chance she'd be pounded into pulp. As she climbed from the crate, she grabbed a dubious-looking rag on a hook. In her estimation, if the potion didn't work, the rag might just do the job on its own. But she was so caught up in her task she'd lost the thread of the conversation going on out there. Folding the rag and tipping a generous dose into it, she hustled to get back to the locker area to find a way to get it smacked over the ogre's gob. I have little to gain in this venture. I, like you, am simply a fan of the sport. Nora paused as Gretchen rounded the corner, waving her arms meaningfully to show her intentions. Of course, I find these matters no less disturbing than you, but... Brack shifted his shoulders to look behind him, but it was too late. Gretchen was already taking a flying leap into the air and landed square on the ogre's back, her legs wrapped around his middle and hands pressing the rag over his face. The ogre wasn't taken completely unaware, however, and turned circles trying to grasp at the witch before turning his attention to pulling her hands away. With a quick maneuver, Gretchen pushed her thumbs back into the ogre's eyeballs, causing him to howl behind the rag. Gretchen thought, incredibly, she was winning the battle when the ogre switched tactics, launching backward to crush her against a wall. Go. 2. Sleep. Gretchen grunted through the pain that would take a month of sessions with a chiropractor to iron out. I'm not trying to murder you, you great big oaf. Brack lurched forward on unsteady feet, almost throwing Gretchen off his back in the process. He careened toward Nora, then fell sideways, crushing Gretchen's leg underneath them. I'm going to need some bone-knit potion after this one, Nora, Gretchen gasped. Don't be so dramatic, Nora tutted as Brack's body turned to dead weight. Not too much now. I was this close to bending him to our cause. Gretchen let the rag fall as she turned her attention to freeing her leg. But shifting that much ogre was going to take a lot more muscle than she could manage. Yeah? Sounded like you could have argued with the guy for all eternity before he connected those dots. He's a fan, Gretchen. Nora pushed from her feet to bunny-hop the chair closer. It's never easy to accept unwelcome truths. Why are you here, anyway? Gretchen strained to pull her stuck leg to no avail. Oh yeah, you're welcome, Nora. Really, there's no need for all that gratitude. Nora scoffed. I could have handled it. Do you have a pocket knife? If you can get it into my hands, I'll cut the binds and get you free. Gretchen reached for her pockets and winced at the damp tinkling of a bunch of potions crushed as she took the fall. The fact they hadn't caused a catastrophic magical event was something to ponder on later, and she freed a slim folding knife she used when foraging for ingredients. With a little effort, Nora managed to turn the chair enough so Gretchen could just get the knife into her fingers, and Gretchen hunted for some healing brews while Nora cut herself loose. What happened upstairs, then? Nora asked as she unwound the ropes binding her and stood with her hands pressed to the small of her back. Magic door. Gretchen uncorked a bone-knit brew and gulped it before searching for something to take care of the pain. Can't get in there without someone taking care of the enchantment. And it's linked to the time slip somehow. Every time I touched the door handle, I got thrown back in time. Nora grabbed Brack's shoulder and heaved, her face flushing with effort. It took a couple of tries, but eventually Gretchen was able to twist her leg free as Nora rolled the ogre onto his stomach. Seems we have all the evidence we need then. Nora dusted her hands on her skirts and caught her breath. Now it's a matter of finding someone who can do something about it, before the match finishes and this magic door of yours fades. What about Anya? Gretchen winced as she sat up. That thug could be doing any number of things to keep her from reporting him. Do you have the hourglass? Nora chewed her lip and snatched it out of Gretchen's hand when she pulled it from one of her larger pockets. The sand at the top was looking woefully low. Gretchen could see the cogs turning in Nora's mind. I doubt we have the time to go searching for her and appeal to the people who can put a stop to the game before the last whistle is blown. We put her into this, Gretchen argued. Larkspire can jump into a lake as far as I'm concerned. Nora's lips twitched. I seem to recall you warning me against angering a minor god of luck. That was before, well, this. Gretchen spread her hands to the slumped bodies littered across the floor. This is bigger than the outcome of one stupid game. People could get hurt. And I don't mean those idiots on the field who knew exactly what they were getting into when they signed up to play. Nora snorted and considered Brack, Marcus, and Zebo's unmoving bodies. Her voice was firm as she surveyed the scene before them. We're going to need allies if we're going to pull this off, she declared, her tone resolute despite the gravity of their situation. Be a dear and help me with Zebo, will you? Chapter 6. It took some doing to get Zebo patched up and back on a cot so Gretchen could work through his injuries. You know, usually I'd tell anyone tending to a person in this condition to keep them unconscious for at least a few days and let the potions do their job, Gretchen complained as she administered a topical ointment for the egg on his head. Well, we don't have time for that, do we? Nora tutted as she checked the binds hog tying the sleeping Brack on the floor. We need the goblin talking by the time this one wakes up, and to keep the steward under until we need him. Wake this one up, put that one to sleep, Gretchen muttered. They aren't puppets, you know. Nonsense. Nothing that a good lie down and a soothing potion won't fix come morning. Gretchen scoffed. Next you'll be telling them all to walk it off. Oh, hush. Despite Gretchen's protests, the goblin's color was improving, and he muttered in his sleep before Gretchen tilted his head to ease another of her medicinals down his gullet. He had enough of her magical stock inside him to qualify as a commercial potion peddler, and she lamented the hours she would need to spend replacing all the ruined and consumed potions about her person. She'd rinsed her skirts as best she could, owing to a corrosive brew which had burned sizable rents through a good many pockets, and with one less boot, she figured she must look like a beggar woman. Nora, on the other hand, appeared to be just fine despite her earlier ordeal in her fine navy woolen dress. When the goblin coughed and writhed on the cot, Gretchen lifted his head and stuffed another pillow underneath to open his airways. Hey there, Zebo, she crooned. You with us, buddy? Hum, he moaned, his green face crinkling with pain. After a few seconds his eyes snapped open in a panic, his arms flailing as he struck out. Come on, Zebo. We're the good guys. Ah, well, gals. You're safe. Gretchen caught one of his hands and pressed it between hers. You've taken quite the punishment tonight, friend. But we need you to help us so we can find your greatest grandmother and put a stop to the game, okay? Zebo stared at Gretchen in confusion, then looked past her to frown at Brack and Marcus. Dishonorable ogre filth. Hey, Brack isn't so bad, we need him. It's Onk that we have to find, and pronto. So once that ogre wakes up, you're going to corroborate our story and tell him what you heard before you got biffed over the head, okay? It is of the utmost importance, Nora added, bending to waft smelling salts underneath Brack's nose, and we need to do it quickly, understand? That means no interspecies squabbling. Zebo curled his lip and went to sit. If greatest grandmother is hurt. Gretchen held a hand to his chest to keep him on the cot. You leave that to us. You have my word that I'll do everything in my power to find her and bring her back safely. Brack groaned, and Zebo stopped fighting against Gretchen's firm hand. It was probably more a case of being too weak than being convinced, though. With the ogre rousing, the goblin turned his glowering attention to Brack, muttering under his breath in a language Gretchen couldn't decipher. Nora dragged a chair over to Brack's head and sat with an air of patience, her hands folded across her ample middle. "Now then, Brack, can you hear me?" She nudged him in the shoulder with the tip of her boot. Brack grunted around the same sock that had been Nora's gag and blinked his eyes blearily. "I regret the circumstances unfolding in this fashion, Brack. I think, given our shared admiration for the game of Jitterball, we would make great friends. But I'm afraid we don't have time for pleasantries, so I must insist that you listen to my friend Zeebo here. I hope he will be more successful in convincing you about this conspiracy than I was." Nora turned her head to the goblin. "Zeebo, if you will." Zeebo looked at Gretchen with a frown, so she gave him an encouraging nod and patted his hand. "Tell him what you saw." Zeebo bared his teeth. "Ogre manager call greatest grandmother hag and say he has big bet on game. Outcome is certain, he demand of steward. He terrible deceiver and cheat. When he says he make greatest grandmother shut up, I defend her honor and have great battle." Gretchen bit her lip at the words great battle and schooled her face to neutral when Nora gave her a warning look. "You see, Zeebo was injured in the first quarter and brought here to be seen to by the doctor." He observed this conversation from behind that curtain. Nora pointed to the small room where Zeebo had been laid up. "Mr. Onk was in cahoots with Marcus here, wasn't he, Zeebo?" The goblin mouthed the words, then asked, "What is cahoots?" "In league, conspiring, scheming, colluding." Nora rubbed her forehead, then clicked her fingers. "Working with. Onk was working with the steward, yes?" Zeebo nodded firmly. "Yes, is cahoots." Nora bent in her seat and reached to pluck the sock from Brack's mouth. "You've heard the goblin. Now I'm going to remove this gag and we're going to have a reasonable conversation, yes?" Brack said something inaudible and nodded his head as far as his restraints allowed. Nora pulled the sock free and smiled. "Good lad. Now, are you convinced?" Brack worked his jaw, his slack features twisting as he apparently tried to resume control of his faculties. "I never thought." "I know," Nora said kindly, "but I'm afraid we don't have time to dwell on that. Anya may very well be in danger, and we need to alert the authorities in order to put a stop to this charade. You have a chance to redeem yourself, Brack. But you'll need to help us, understand?" Brack's mouth hung open as he evidently warred with his decision, but eventually he nodded and slurred, "What do you want from me?" Gretchen's shoulders sagged with relief, and she squeezed Zeebo's hand, who was muttering darkly under his breath. "Well, my friend Nancy and I can't go herring off and leave the steward here unsupervised for a start. We shall need to move all three of you to a more secure location until we are ready to report matters. And I imagine you might have an idea about who we should be speaking to at that. My guess is that the constabulary won't be any help." "Those guys are useless," Gretchen scoffed. "Last time my shop got broken into, it took them a week to show up and take my statement." Says she who refused to invest in the most rudimentary security charms. Nora scoffed as she stood to untie the ogre's binds. "But I expect the person we need to report this to is at the top of the Jitterball food chain. That is, so long as this plot doesn't run so deep as to make them complicit, too." Brack groaned as his limbs straightened, and he uncurled himself to stretch groggily. "That's easy. Mr. Silverthorn would never do something like." "Silverthorn?" Nora exclaimed. "He was managing this place when I was a youngster. It must be a family concern then, I'm guessing. Silverthorn Jr." The ogre shook his head and slowly pushed himself upward with a bracing hand against the wall. "Not Junior. As far as everyone knows, he doesn't have no family." "The man must be, well, very old indeed. That is to say, he was no spring chicken back when I took to the field." "Must be ancient then," Gretchen sniggered. Brack stood leaning against the wall, catching his breath. "There's whispers about an elf hidden somewhere in his family tree. He's old, but he ain't feeble." Marcus twisted and moaned on the floor, and every eye in the room snapped toward him. "Quickly, Nancy, where did you leave that rag?" "On it, Chatty Cathy." Gretchen stood and reclaimed the damp rag from a shelf as she strode toward the steward. Not trusting Nora to administer the correct dose, she held it out of reach as she strode past her friend, and hoped a quick sniff wouldn't render him useless later. The last thing they needed was a comatose Exhibit A when the time came. She'd already given the guy the once-over while tending to Zeebo and reckoned he would have a mighty headache come morning. We must get moving. It's a marvel that we haven't been discovered already. You know this place better than us, Brack. Where can we find somewhere safe to get you lot moved to? Brack patted the keys on his belt thoughtfully. Storage rooms, maybe? Greatest grandmother used forgotten storage rooms sometimes, Zeebo volunteered. Says help her think when grandson's too rowdy. But not usually during match. This isn't an ordinary match, though. But 2 birds with 1 stone, Gretchen said as she rose from the now sleeping steward's side. We might be able to keep the band together, so to speak. Nora nodded slowly. Now to figure out how to move Zeebo and Marcus without drawing too much attention. It turned out that trolleys regularly employed to cart junk to the storage rooms at the very bottom of the stadium were just the right size to hide a body, which was both a relief and disconcerting all at the same time. They made easy work of securing Marcus in a spare net used for the goals, while Zeebo lay on a bed of heaped uniforms with a bunch of towels arranged carefully on top. Brack pushed Marcus on wobbly legs, appearing to rely on the handles for support, while Nora and Gretchen followed with Zeebo. The descent began on the path to the storage rooms where Brack had been posted earlier. A door stood at the bottom of the stairwell, which Gretchen hadn't noticed on the way in. Rather than stairs, a ramp allowed the trolleys downward, the hallways dimly lit with the occasional lantern. Getting the trolley turned around corners had Gretchen and Nora grunting with effort, but after a couple of junctions they arrived into flat corridors that smelled of dust and damp. "Which way?" Nora whispered. "Laundry's down there." Brack pointed to the right, keeping his gravelly voice low. "And each team has a room along this hallway. Silverthorn has the keys to the ones at the end, but maybe it's best to use one of the other teams." Good thinking. As Brack guided them deeper into the hallway, Gretchen's senses heightened, straining for any hint of movement. The thought of encountering Ankh sent a chill down her spine. None of them were prepared for such a confrontation. Yet luck seemed to be on their side as they reached a door marked Starfire Storm. Gretchen couldn't help but wonder about the species it belonged to, but she knew there was no time for idle questions. With a sense of urgency, she wheeled in Zeebo to follow Brack closely, swiftly closing the door behind them, as the goblin freed himself from the towels, then took a moment to compose herself with a steadying breath. "Good grief," Nora exclaimed, causing Gretchen to poke her friend sharply in the ribs with a warning finger pressed to her mouth. She held the hourglass aloft and stared at it in dismay, its glow lighting the dark room. The sand from the top was falling fast. "We may very well be done for." Nora's face fell, but at least she kept her voice low. "That was 4 time slips, by my reckoning." Zeebo and Brack exchanged puzzled glances, their expressions mirroring their uncertainty. Suddenly, a faint reverberation shuddered through the floors, accompanied by muffled sounds of a stadium full of spectators cheering from above. Gretchen's shoulders sagged with a weighty mix of exhaustion and frustration. They had come too far, faced too many obstacles, for their quest to end in failure because of something as arbitrary as time slipping away. As she stared at the hourglass, its dwindling sand a stark reminder of their diminishing opportunity, a spark of memory ignited in her mind. "Nope." She shook her head determinedly. "I remember the end of the game clearly. You were nearly frothing at the mouth. Nor I mean, Chatty Cathy. There's a time slip right at the end of the game, and we haven't reached it yet." "What's that?" Brack asked with a puzzled frown. "And what do you mean, end of the game?" Nora's eyes brightened with calculation. "Never you mind that, dear ogre. We haven't the time. Now, if you'd be a good lad and provide us with the key to the Shadow Streaker's room and directions to Mr. Silverthorn's office, we can be about our business before it's too late." Brack obliged while Gretchen fussed over Zeebo, then untwisted the netting from around Marcus's head. Plucking a light charm from her pockets, she muttered an incantation to allow the bottle to emanate a faint glow, which she hoped wouldn't draw attention from the hallway. Zeebo still considered the ogre with suspicious, if not contemptuous beady eyes, and Gretchen hoped leaving the 3 to their own devices wasn't a recipe for disaster. But the last time she and her friend had split up yielded disastrous results, and she had a bad feeling about Anya's absence. It was far too quiet to hope for a simple argument taking place between the respective team managers. "Ready?" Nora asked briskly. Gretchen nodded. "Let's do this." After slipping into the hallway again, they tracked back toward the laundry, then began peering at each door to make sure they didn't pass the shadow streaker's room. "We've missed it," Gretchen whispered and stuck a thumb over her shoulder. "It's got to be back there somewhere." "We have not." Nora huffed under her breath. "It must be the next one." "I'll go back and—" "Absolutely not." Nora clung to Gretchen's elbow. "We stick together. Now come and—" Nora's grip on Gretchen's elbow tightened as the last door in the hallway swung open, allowing a gush of steam to outline the figure standing there. They considered each other like strange cats for a moment before the brownie, Yvette, opened her mouth in apparent indignation. Gretchen and Nora stared at each other for a split second before rushing the brownie to keep her from squalling, their footfalls on the worn timber boards deafening. Yvette let out a shriek before they could clamp a hand over her mouth and draw her back into the laundry room. Gretchen allowed Nora to do most of the manhandling and turned back toward the hallway in a panic, closing the door firmly before they could be discovered. Chapter 7. Nora grappled with the brownie, her face contorting in pain as Yvette's teeth sank into her hand. With a yelp, Nora waved her injured hand in the air, desperately trying to shake off the biting tiny cleaner. Quick to act, Gretchen seized the brownie by the scruff of her neck and stuffed a laundered sock from the discarded basket deftly into her mouth, silencing any potential outcry. "Yvette, there's no time to explain, but we're working with Brack to uncover a scheme to rig the game going on up there as we speak." Gretchen pointed toward the ceiling. "We think Anya, the goblin's greatest grandmother, might be here under duress by Alm who's in on the deal, understand? That ruckus we just caused will have drawn attention, and I'd say we are moments away from someone stamping through that door demanding to know what's going on. If you care about Anya's safety, you'll tell him you saw a rat. That'll work. Then you can go running to Silverthorn himself to alert him to our presence down here with our blessing. You with me?" Nora shot Gretchen a skeptical look as she nursed her injured finger, while Gretchen, cheeks puffed out in determination, silently urged the brownie to comply with their demands. After spitting out the sock, her little features twisted in rage. "You two," she hissed, thankfully keeping her voice low. "I heard about 2 supposed human cleaners telling people I was sick." "Not enough time to get to the details, Yvette." Gretchen held her hands up in frustration with teeth clenched. "When someone opens that door, I hope you'll take it as a sign that what we're saying is true, yeah? The clock is ticking, and someone's liable to get—" "Shush." Nora waved her hands frantically, and Gretchen winced at the sound of footfalls behind the door. Seeking cover, Gretchen dove behind a towering stack of mucky towels, while Nora took refuge behind a large, steaming copper laundry tub, the heat radiating off its surface adding to the tension of the moment. Not trusting her hiding spot enough to risk a peek, Gretchen huddled down and willed her heart to stop thumping at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It was either going to explode out of her chest and make the towels impossible to clean or be so loud as to render her hiding spot useless. But the voice coming from behind her was far too smooth for that of an ogre, befuddling Gretchen enough to make her almost forget about potential cardiac failure. What was the cacophony in here, Brownie? It sounded like an entire team stampeding through the hallway. Gretchen closed her eyes, hoping beyond hope that her hasty tirade was enough for Yvette to believe them. "Oh, Yvette giggled nervously. "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, esteemed sir. There was a rat scurrying around. Gave me quite a fright." Gretchen balled her fists as silence stretched on for seconds. It seemed Yvette would set no world records in the lying department, and whoever was at the door wasn't buying what she was selling. "Please," Gretchen pleaded with the universe. "Just throw a witch a damn bone." Maybe it was the universe, or perhaps a certain minor god of luck who intervened at that moment, because when the man scoffed, the next words weren't what she expected. "Whoever heard of a brownie scared of rats? Don't your sort relish cleaning up filth? I imagine rats are an occupational hazard you should be well accustomed to." A surge of anger coursed through Gretchen as she listened to the man's contemptuous remarks. She wouldn't mind bumping into the guy in a dark alley sometime. She could teach him a thing or two about the consequences of speciesism rampant in their society. But what they really needed was for Yvette to get him out of the laundry as quickly as possible. Gretchen's nose prickled, and she stuffed a finger under her nostril to keep any potential sneezes at bay. My apologies, sir, it won't happen again. I suggest you buzz off and find somewhere else to polish. I'll not take kindly to being disturbed a second time. Of course, Yvette squeaked. The door closed, and with bated breath, Gretchen waited for the footsteps to recede into the distance before daring to make a move, her senses on high alert. That was Malachi Swiftwind. Nora hissed as she crawled from her hiding spot. Gretchen pinched her nose and groaned. And that's supposed to mean something? He's a wizard. Yvette turned to them with her arms folded over her chest. He spends quite a lot of time at the stadium. I knew that. Gretchen waved a hand and cast around for a scrap of linen. Well, not about him being here all the time, but my nose is going to itch all darn night now. What is she talking about? Yvette asked with a frown. Gretchen tore a strip of linen from something resembling a bedsheet and proceeded to stuff each end up her nostrils. She's allergic to wizards, apparently. Nora eyed the spectacle with distaste. Though I admit I have seen the effects. Still, I have no idea how someone can possibly be allergic to a wizard, but that's beside the point. I know Malachi, and I know which household he works for. He's a sly sort, often running errands for his Lord Benton. The high roller upstairs? Gretchen adjusted her nose plugs. That explains the magic door then. But if he's down here, then I'm guessing it isn't Ankh we need to subdue in the goblin storage room. What are you two talking about? Yvette demanded, balling her tiny fists in frustration. I just crossed a wizard on your say-so, so if you don't tell me what's going on now, I'll fetch him back here. Like I said, no time to explain. Be a doll and go find Silverthorn for us, won't you? Gretchen fumbled in her pockets, trying to recall if she had an allergy potion tucked away somewhere. By the time you get him down here, we'll have Anya safe and sound and be ready to put a stop to the game. No, the brownie said with sullen determination. I won't be a doll. You two are trespassing here, and it'll be my job on the line when it turns out you've escaped while I go herring off to find the boss. She needs assurances, Nancy, Nora said as she pushed herself from the floor. If you must check our credentials, I suggest you look in on the Starfire Storm storage room and speak with Brack. He'll vouch for us. The brownie only narrowed her eyes in suspicion, and Nora pulled out the hourglass to hold under her nose. See? There's hardly any time at all left in the match, and if we don't put a stop to it, then, well, the people responsible for meddling in the outcome of this match will have won, won't they? Wagers will be paid in full, and it'll be a terrible mess to sort out the paperwork. I'd say Mr. Silverthorn will be furious. If nothing else, the mention of Silverthorn's ire caused the brownie's eyes to widen. Appearing to mull it over for a moment, the brownie pursed her lips, then drew herself up to her full and tiny height. If I find Brack hurt, I'll make sure you two pay for this. I never forget a face, you know. Certainly, Nora nodded emphatically. Now I'm afraid we must hurry. No time to lose and all. Gretchen puffed out her cheeks as she ran out of pockets to check, thinking that the allergy potion was among those that got busted back in the locker room. It meant that she was determined to deal with the wizard as swiftly as she could, so she ignored the exchange between Yvette and Nora to seek something suitable for the job in the back of the laundry room. When Gretchen untangled her prize from a crowded corner, she returned to Nora, who stood there alone and brandished a stout laundry paddle for her consideration. Good grief. What do you plan on doing with that? You're not the only one who can smack people over the head, you know? Sheesh, this time it might even work. Nora made a face but looked past her friend thoughtfully. Any more of those back there? Once the pair were armed, they crept out of the laundry room into the darkened hallway. So, have you devised a cunning plan, or are we winging it again? Gretchen murmured. I should think Mr. Ankh got one thing right when he said you can't perform magic while you're unconscious. Full berserker then? I tell you, my joints are going to pay for this come morning. You sound like an old woman. Excuse me? We are old women. The pair continued through the hallway, Gretchen limping clad in only one boot, checking the chalked team names on each door. Gretchen bit back a good dose of smugness when they headed back in the direction she insisted on earlier. They couldn't afford to be squabbling by the time they arrived, so she kept her amusement to herself and gripped the laundry paddle in readiness. When they stopped at the right door, Nora produced the key Brack handed her and bit her lip as she slid it into the lock. Rather than fussing to turn it in the mechanism slowly and painfully, Gretchen batted Nora's hand away and clicked the key in the lock, using her shoulder to open the door as swiftly as possible. With a flailing paddle in hand and a shrieking war cry, or what Gretchen guessed was a war cry, given she'd never been close enough to a battlefield to actually hear one before, she burst into the room with Nora hot on her heels. Trying to take in the room's contents all at once, Gretchen tried to dismiss the sight of Anya secured to a chair with her hands tied behind her, and instead took a wide swing at the wizard who glared at them in surprise. He dodged the wooden paddle, causing Gretchen to overextend and fall in a heap on the floor. With Gretchen as an obstacle between Nora and Malachi, it gave the wizard a chance to hold up his hand in readiness to cast who knows what, so Gretchen reached for his boot to give it a yank, causing him to crumple on top of her. Nora, having always been a witch who knew an opportunity when she saw one, took it in both hands as she beat her paddle down, bashing Gretchen almost as much as Malachi as she screeched like a banshee. Gretchen tried to curl herself into a protective ball, but with the wizard's limbs entangled with hers, it was an impossible task. Worse yet was the pressure building behind her temporary nose plugs, and when she finally sneezed, they ejected themselves over the wizard's face. "What in the—" Malachi grunted. Gretchen used her one-booted foot to crunch the wizard behind the knee and attempted to drag herself free while dodging Nora's blows. It was unfortunate that none were any danger of connecting with the wizard's head, so once Gretchen was clear, she waved for Nora to stop. "I think we have the upper hand here. Quick, sit on him, and I'll find us some rope." "I will not sit on the likes of him," Nora shrilled, her gray curls frizzing around her face like some deranged halo. She thumped him again for good measure. "It's indecent." Gretchen grimaced as she stood. It would be quicker to count the places that didn't hurt at that point. Fine. Let's make sure we hold on to our sensibilities while we're bludgeoning a man in a dark basement. "What are you hags doing down here?" Malachi roared. "Is that you, Nora Brightstar? What does the Baron of Greenhaven have to do with this?" "I'm no longer in the Baron's service." Nora gave the wizard a sharp poke in the ribs with the paddle. "I'm here because I won't stand for the likes of you tarnishing the good name of Jitterball, understand? When your master hears of this, you'll be out on your ear, let me tell you." Gretchen crawled to Anya's side and hastily began to untie the greatest grandmother so she could repurpose the ropes. Her fingers fumbled in their urgency, and the pressure building inside her head wasn't helping. The goblin appeared to be in a daze, one that must have been magically induced by Gretchen's estimation. She dragged a sleeve under her nose, feeling another sneeze coming. Malachi howled with sardonic laughter, only marred by the occasional cough and grunt of pain. "Out on my ear? You think I'm acting against him?" Nora halted mid-swing and frowned before a slow smile spread over her face. "Of course, he's in on it too, isn't he? He quite enjoys a large wager, and on the face of it he's always the loser. But I suspect his purse will be no lighter after he leaves the stadium tonight, huh? Probably a good deal heavier, in fact." Gretchen sneezed heavily and wiped her watering eyes. "The door, Nora." She waved her hand in that direction. "It's too stuffy in here with his reek." Nora gave her an irritated scowl and held the paddle in warning as she took 2 steps backward to reach for the door handle. "What a lot of fuss, Gretchen." But then the door opened, knocking Nora in the shoulder, and the silhouette of Mr. Onk filled the threshold. Taking the opportunity, Malachi reached for the paddle in Nora's hand to yank it from her grip as Gretchen watched in horror. "What's going on in here?" Onk bellowed. He grabbed Nora by the scruff of the neck and wrenched her backward so he could stare at her face. "You again." "Witches, both of them." Malachi stood with the paddle in hand, then advanced on Gretchen, who sat on the floor dumbly, her paddle out of reach. "The fat one works for the Baron of Greenhaven. She denies it, but what else would she be doing here?" "You'll never get away with this," Nora shrilled. "I'm a witch of good standing in this city, you know. I'll bring the entire wrath of the Witches' Academy down on you both." Malachi snorted his disdain, and Onk shook Nora with a sneer. Gretchen held her booted foot ready to kick away Malachi's hand as he reached for her, but with the paddle looming threateningly above her head, she wasn't sure if it was wise to start another melee. In short order, Ankh and the wizard had Nora and Gretchen tied together sitting back to back on the floor. Gretchen had been saved from the gag Nora wore around her mouth on account of her nose running wretchedly and bursting into fits of sneezes whenever the wizard got close enough to try. "I've got to get back to the sidelines before the referee blows that whistle." Ankh nodded toward Anya. "Is she ready?" "I can rouse her," Malachi said, though lines of worry etched his forehead. "She'll be confused. Disorientated. I can't say for certain what she'll remember. Perhaps we should leave it until after." "So long as she doesn't interfere with the last few minutes of the game, it doesn't matter." Ankh advanced on the greatest grandmother. "It'll look worse if she's missing at the sidelines when her precious grandsons limp off the field." Gretchen stared at Anya, who seemed oblivious to the goings-on around her. It was worse than a memory wipe potion. Malachi was fiddling directly with her head. Wizards always took the blunt approach. It would be a wonder if Anya was herself at all once she was roused. "As you wish. But waking her in front of these two might be unwise. I can stuff them in our storage room for now. How long will it take for you to do that mumbo-jumbo on them?" "Properly?" Malachi eyed Gretchen and Nora with calculation. "I'd say at least a few hours." Nora squeaked around her gag, and Gretchen opened her mouth to protest, but her teeth clicked shut. She hadn't come all this way to have the magical equivalent of a frontal lobe lobotomy performed on her in the dark recesses of a Jitterball stadium. She didn't even like the game. No, she'd sooner fill herself with combustion-level magic and take her tormentors with her. Except, well, she didn't want to hurt Nora. Or Anya, for that matter. "Then do it after the match when everybody leaves. I'm sure your lord can see himself home. Here, help me with the witches." Fury ignited within Gretchen as their focus shifted back to her, prompting her to dig deep for every ounce of magic she possessed. With adrenaline coursing through her veins, she prepared to confront them with all the strength she could muster. But then the door opened again, and a pale aging man in a finely tailored suit stood at the threshold with two formidable ogre security guards behind him. The newcomer's voice cut through the tension like a knife, his crisp tone tinged with curiosity and authority. His piercing gaze swept over the scene, leaving an air of uncertainty lingering in its wake. "What, exactly, is going on here?" he asked crisply. Chapter 8. With the help of Silverthorn's aides, the group quickly gathered in the VIP lounge, the plush furnishings offering a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding within. Yvette must have passed at least some details on to the stadium manager because he did so without any questions when Nora insisted on making the climb. After getting the dazed Anya settled on a sofa next to Zebo stretched out on a makeshift cot on the floor, Gretchen jabbed a finger toward the door with a scowl etched deep into her features, her frustration palpable. "Exhibit A right there." She strode over to poke at the magic door handle, which did nothing except rattle in the mechanism. "What in tarnation?" "You had the hourglass at the time, magical interference and all that." Nora plucked the hourglass from her pocket and held it aloft smugly. Gretchen's mouth worked as she stared between the handle and the hourglass. "Mr. Silverthorn, if you'd be so kind as to call a pause in the game? I'm afraid this will all be for naught if the match concludes and the bookkeepers begin handing out coin," Nora said. "What is going on here, Silverthorn?" the Baron of Summerglen demanded, not for the first time. His companion, Lord Benton, sat slumped in his chair, casting nervous glances toward the stairs where two beefy ogres stood barring the exit. "I order you?" "Momentarily, Lord," Silverthorn said coldly and gave Gretchen a strange look as he opened the door to the timekeeper's room without incident, clicking his fingers at the security guards to haul two men from their posts. Gretchen craned her head to see inside and watched as Silverthorn tapped a device on the desk and spoke into it. Magical interference? She remembered the heat of the hourglass in her pocket when she'd been thrown back in time and felt a little chagrined. But she didn't have time to dwell on that as Silverthorn's voice boomed across the stadium, causing Gretchen to almost jump out of her skin in shock. "As the stadium manager, Eldrin Silverthorn, I must call a brief halt to the match. Players, stay where you are, and spectators, stay seated and ensure you have your tickets and any receipts for wagers in hand until I give you further instruction." The stadium was eerily quiet for a moment before the booing started. Silverthorn appeared to ignore it as he returned, frowning at another device in his hand which resembled a pendulum with a button on top. "Now begin, Miss Brightstar." Gretchen had been too beat up to listen closely to what Nora had whispered to Silverthorn on their route to the top of the stadium. There were far too many stairs to climb for a witch in her condition, and none of the guards could be persuaded to carry her while they carted Marcus, Zebo, and Anya up at the end of the odd procession. She was too fatigued to even care that much about their true identities being revealed in the end, but she was sure that'd come later. Right then, all she wanted was a nip of witch's brew and a soft bed to collapse in. But she slid down a wall to the floor instead, knowing Nora well enough to figure that this would take a while. Nora cleared her throat and stepped into the middle of the room. "There have been very dark doings in this stadium this night, ladies and gentlemen. I can point my finger at no fewer than 6 people in this very room who are complicit in a conspiracy to meddle with the outcome of this match by way of magical interference. I would hazard a guess, Mr. Silverthorn, that you hold the very device that has been used on multiple occasions this evening to cause time slips which favor the Thunderhulks and will ensure the Shadow Streakers lose this match. Is this a joke, Silverthorn?" The Baron puffed himself up incredulously. "Your man had a word with me when I arrived and said the goblins had an edge tonight. I have a sizable wager to prove it." "This one." Brack rolled Marcus out of the netting they'd secured him in and across the floor. The steward groaned in his sleep. Gretchen hoped the official wasn't beyond smelling salts when the time came to rouse him for questioning. "The very same." The Baron's face reddened. "He's your man, Silverthorn, and any wager I." "My men do not give advice on how spectators such as yourself should spend their coin with the bookkeepers," Silverthorn said, his voice icy. "If this one did, I'd have questioned his motives before placing a substantial wager. Perhaps I'm old-fashioned, but it seems very close to cheating to me." He turned his attention to Nora. "Continue." Nora lifted her chin. "The greatest grandmother Anya, who is quite incapacitated as you can plainly see, disclosed to myself and my colleague here that an official approached her on their training grounds with a proposal to have her team lose this match. She, of course, declined his offer." "That's a lie." Ankh strained against the security guards holding him. "Are you going to take the word of 2 witches and a goblin?" "You'll keep quiet, Mr. Ankh, or I'll have you removed this very second," Silverthorn said with an air of impatience. The ogre team manager snarled but must have decided it was better to hear the evidence presented against him than be stuffed somewhere to be dealt with later. "Yes, well, ahem," Nora resumed. "When we spoke with her in the Shadow Streakers' locker room, she was tending Zebo here, who was injured at the start of the match. Later, when I almost apprehended Marcus in the Shadow Streakers' locker room, Zebo overheard Mr. Ankh and the steward Marcus discussing the matter while I was tied to a chair, with an implied threat to keep Anya from ruining their plans. This caused him to come to my rescue, bless him, but he was struck down rather cruelly by Ankh after rendering the steward unconscious. Isn't that right, Zebo?" "Yes, is cahoots." He nodded fervently. "Says outcome of Jitterball is decided. Lots of coin at stake." "Precisely," Nora said. "Now, Mr. Ankh here, convinced that I was working for Anya to denounce them, stationed Brack to watch over me and left poor Zebo in a heap. Except my good ogre here simply wouldn't stand for this slight on the good name of Jitterball and agreed to assist us in our cause. Isn't that so?" Nora nodded encouragingly at Brack. The ogre swallowed and nodded sheepishly as heads turned toward him. "Yup." Too modest by half, Nora guffawed and continued. "Fearing for Anya's safety, we hurried to the storage areas, where Zebo suspected she might have fled to. We discovered there that Malachi Swiftwind had the greatest grandmother tied and under a magical malaise of the mind. We tried. Poppycock and slander." Lord Benton pointed at Nora with wild eyes. "Of course, 2 witches would seek to tarnish the good name of my wizard. They're like cats and dogs. I won't stand for Malachi taking the fall for some sorceress's ill deeds." Nora planted her fists on her hips. "Except this time my witness is Mr. Silverthorn himself, Benton." The Lord's mouth worked, and he looked at Silverthorn, whose face was a frosty mask. "Now, as I was saying," Nora said tartly, "we tried to apprehend him, but when Mr. Ankh returned to take the greatest grandmother to the sidelines so as to not rouse suspicion, we were assaulted and tied up. Without the assistance of Yvette here, who agreed to fetch Mr. Silverthorn beforehand, I fear we would be in the same condition as Anya by now. Did I not say, Yvette, that the greatest grandmother was in grave danger? The brownie, who had hitherto been a quiet observer standing against a wall unobtrusively, stepped forward. They did. It was that one who did most of the talking. She pointed at Gretchen, who hoped the brownie wouldn't mention a sock being stuffed in her mouth. I can't remember every word, but they were sneaking around and panicking about being found by someone who was hurting the goblin's grandmother. They told me I could go tell Mr. Silverthorn himself when I accused them of trespassing and said Brack was holed up in the Starfire Storm's room down there. Brack told me I should do as they asked and was looking after those two. She pointed to Zebo and Marcus. And, Mr. Silverthorn, you know the rest. When you discovered us in the Shadow Streaker's storage room, Mr. Onk and Malachi had us trussed up like a turkey dinner. Caught red-handed. Nora smiled smugly and folded her arms, but the uproar in the room from all quarters didn't appear to be what she was hoping for. It was us that apprehended them, sir. Witches are unreliable. Who even are they? Gretchen stood with a wince and waved her arm. Shut your traps, the lot of you. When that didn't work, Gretchen grunted and limped into the timekeeper's room to press the device Silverthorn had used earlier. Quiet. Smirking as she wondered what the crowd outside made of that, she turned to put her game face on and glowered at the assembled witnesses and bystanders in the lounge. It's really very simple. Marcus convinces the Baron here to place a big fat wager on the goblins, which means the bookies down there are accepting big bets on the ogres. Lord What's-his-name here, who is Malachi's employer, probably egged on the Baron in the first place, and is in cahoots with Onk to make sure the goblins lose. The timekeepers here are in on it, and are using whatever Silverthorn is holding there to meddle with time. I'm going to keep it simple here and pin that on Malachi too. Is that all 6 now? Onk, Malachi and his Lord Marcus and those 2 nitwits in the timekeeper's box. Plus, whoever tried to grease Anya's hands. Now, I don't know about you, but I figure we invite the bookies up here to clue them in. Justice might be hard to come by in this city, but I don't hear about many folks who have the nerve to cheat bookkeepers and don't have at least some broken bones for their trouble. Malachi, who had been holding himself with feigned dignity with his hands secured behind his back until then, cried, "Deceivers! You are all being played. Sirs, tell me, what were they doing here in the first place?" "They are attempting to pin their own crimes on friends of the game. I fear this is going to take some time to iron out." Silverthorn's sigh filled the room with a weighty sense of resignation. "Basil, go fetch the constabulary and a representative from the Wizards Guild and Witches Academy with the means to assist in this investigation. Proper questioning must take place, and send over an accountant right away. We shall need to tally the cost of the night's events and send people home with their wagers returned to them and a complimentary ticket to next week's match." Gretchen's shoulders slumped, the weight of impending consequences settling heavily over her. Her sister Cordelia, as the vice-chancellor of the academy, would be alerted to the night's events. That's just what they needed. A small man who Gretchen hadn't noticed in the back of the room nodded eagerly and slipped past the ogres positioned at the door. "But the wizard here raises an important question. What were you 2 doing sneaking around my stadium? Did you have prior knowledge of this? And if so, why did you neglect to come straight to my office to inform me of your investigation?" "Don't say Larkspire, don't say Larkspire," Gretchen pleaded silently. She was about to open her mouth to spew some kind of cover story, but Nora beat her to it. "I am simply a great fan of the game, Mr. Silverthorn." She spread her hands magnanimously, then tapped the side of her nose. "And I know magical interference when I see it. Luckily I had just the device to sense when these time slips occurred during the match." "Convenient." Silverthorn raised an eyebrow. "And I suppose you expect some kind of reward for your trouble?" "Not at all." Nora waved her hand. "It's been our pleasure." "Reward?" Gretchen spluttered. "How about restitution? I've lost an entire stock of potions, 1 boot, this dress is well beyond darning, and I'll need to see my chiropractor for goodness knows how long after the battering I've taken during the course of this investigation." Silverthorn looked Gretchen up and down and wrinkled his nose. "We can discuss your restitution once these allegations have been proven." Gretchen snorted and rolled her eyes. He was a businessman after all. She folded her arms and figured the guy would have his accountant deduct wear and tear from her boots and dress and stiff her on the potions. Well then, Silverthorn pressed his hands together. Until the authorities can take carriage of the investigation, I'll decide what happens next. I want all the accused held in separate rooms until they can be questioned, and the same for our witnesses, of course. That includes you, Lord Summerglen. You two? He pointed at Nora and Gretchen. I'll watch over personally in my office. Gretchen's hand scraped wearily across her face as Nora's eager nodding continued beside her. As brisk directions were given to guards and other stadium employees to take people away to wait, Zeebo flew into an uproar until he could be assured that he would remain with the greatest grandmother. It was all that the ogre's security guards could do to put a stop to Lord Summerglen, flying into a seething rage at Lord Benton, and Nora joined Gretchen at the window overlooking the stadium. Exciting, isn't it? Nora grinned widely. For you, maybe, Gretchen grunted. But I think you're forgetting that we're going to be questioned too. They'll have some sort of device to make sure we aren't lying, you know. Cordelia and whoever they drag out of the Wizards Guild will insist on it. A shadow crossed Nora's features, betraying her worry. They wouldn't, would they? Cancel our licenses, I mean. I think if they didn't, it would be a pretty big stroke of luck. Nora didn't reply right away. We did as he asked. Surely Larkspire wouldn't hang us out to dry. Well, you know what they say. Fortune is a fickle mistress or master, I guess. Gretchen frowned as she stared at the stands beneath them, where one face was pointed in their direction. She pressed her hands against the window to squint, and a wrinkly head came into focus. Nora followed her gaze and gasped. Larkspire the imp, minor god of luck, stood grinning broadly at the pair, his yellow eyes sparkling from beneath his hood. Holding his arms out, he moved his hands together to encircle a vague shape in hourglass which brightened into a blinding light, then clapped his hands together to cause it to disappear. The people surrounding him appeared completely oblivious to his presence, and Nora squeaked beside her. Gretchen tore her eyes from the imp to watch Nora pat down her pockets. It's gone. Gretchen looked back to the crowd where Larkspire had been standing. So is he. What do you suppose that means? Let's hope it's a sign that he scrubbed all evidence of his involvement from the case, Gretchen said thoughtfully. But they would need to wait to find out. Chapter 9. In their usual booth at the Swine and Claw, the city's only tavern catering exclusively to magical types, Gretchen and Nora nestled amid the establishment's rustic charm, enveloped by the comforting scent of roasted meat and ale. The dimly lit interior hummed with conversation and laughter, providing a welcome respite from the city's ever-present sense of urgency. Here they savored the comforts of good ale, and even better company, tucked away from the bustling crowd. Each of them nursed a mug of ale, and Gretchen wore an old but serviceable dress and an even older, and less serviceable, pair of boots. Tassels? Nora scoffed. And why not? Gretchen thumped her mug on the table. When you're sent to a hoity-toity tailor in the city by a rich guy, you ask for all the trimmings, don't ya? No witch worth her salt gets about with tassels on, Gretchen. Nora waved her hand dismissively. Nobody would take you seriously. Nobody takes me seriously anyway, Gretchen argued. Besides, Alinda Brimming goes around with all sorts of frills and awful bright colors. And look at how other witches sneer at her, Nora tutted. Next you'll be telling me you ordered a pair of ruby-red boots from the cobbler. Gretchen opened her mouth, and then clicked her teeth shut. Perhaps she shouldn't have gotten carried away at the notion that someone else was footing the bill for her new outfit. Anyway, Gretchen cleared her throat. He said I could call on the chiropractor at the stadium whenever I needed. That's something I fully intend to capitalize on. If that guy works on Jitterball players, then he has to be pretty good at his trade, don't you think? I should think so, Nora agreed as she took a sip of ale. Has Cordelia stopped in at the shop? Gretchen shifted on the padded seat, her bones still protesting at every movement since waking in brutal pain that morning despite the potions she'd gulped before going to sleep. She reminded herself for the umpteenth time that day that she was getting too old for adventuring. Of course she didn't. She had some youngster come and fetch me and insisted I climb all those stairs to her office. Nora smirked. And? She suspects something fishy is going on. Nora chewed her lip. I thought we must have passed their tests during the interrogation. They didn't say anything while. Cordelia always thinks I'm up to something fishy. Gretchen made a face. But it was the fallout with the wizards that she was concerned about. They've accused the Academy of sending us there to humiliate one of their members publicly. Of course they did, Nora snorted. Better to dwell on that than admit wrongdoing. Here you go, ladies. Bartok, the goblin bartender, dropped a newspaper on the table and refilled their mugs. The kids said they held up the printers late last night until they could get the scoop on what happened at the stadium. Thank you, Bartok. Nora snatched the newspaper and began reading greedily. Gretchen only had a moment to read the word stadium scandal on the front page and shared an amused smile with the bartender before he shuffled off to tend to other customers. Of course, the entire city had been whispering about the events at the Jitterball game all day, and when she'd finally arrived at the Swine and Claw, Gretchen had heard all kinds of fanciful stories about what had happened. Her favorite was the one where they claimed the players had been replaced by shape-shifting goblins from the underworld, and the entire match was actually a covert ritual to summon a horde of dancing demons onto the field. Not even a word about us, Nora shrilled. They make it sound like the constabulary had a planned sting operation underway. Listen, rumors of illicit magical activity at the Jitterball match have been confirmed by anonymous sources within the city's law enforcement. The constabulary, in collaboration with representatives from the Wizards Guild, apprehended several individuals suspected of tampering with the outcome of the game. Details remain scarce, but sources suggest that the scandal may involve high-ranking officials and prominent figures within the Jitterball community. It's as if we were mere bystanders in our own investigation. Gretchen chuckled softly, the sound mingling with the clinking of mugs and murmurs of conversation around them. And the Wizards Guild is on top again, our own very saviors. Typical, isn't it? It's outrageous. Hey, you agreed when we set out that we were incognito. Which reminds me. Gretchen rummaged in the pouch fixed to her belt and drew out a small vial. You agreed to take a memory wipe potion afterwards. Nora's face fell from outrage into shock. But that's absurd. Everyone knows we were involved. Why should we need to? In fact, it would look downright iffy should we suddenly be unable to recall the night's events. Gretchen had expected this when she'd carefully written the name Larkspire on a scrap of paper and let it fall into the simmering brew in the early hours of the morning before she went to bed. Sure, they'd gotten away with their story so far. She wasn't entirely certain how they'd fooled the lie detectors, but had a good idea of who was capable of raining down that kind of good luck. But she still didn't trust Nora not to let something slip after a good amount of witch's brew in her belly. It wasn't her fault that she got a little talkative when she let her guard down. The potion was simply insurance. So she set the vial firmly in front of Nora and folded her hands around its twin in front of her. There's only one thing to forget, Nora. You know who he is. So you'll have to have faith in my skills in making a precision-perfect potion that'll do the deed. But nobody needs to know. Nora pleaded in a whisper. A deal is a deal. Gretchen shrugged. And it's not like it'll change anything. Besides, I doubt we'll be seeing him again, will we? Nora huffed, her features twisted in a scowl, but after staring at each other in the manner of strange cats for a time, she finally sighed and rolled her eyes. Fine, but if this goes wrong and our cover is suddenly blown, it'll be on your head, you understand? Uh-huh. Gretchen uncorked the vial in front of her and held it to her lips with a pointed look. Nora gave her a penetrating stare as she did the same. Bottoms up. Gretchen swallowed the dose of a particular concoction to help with dry eyes, which she was certain wouldn't have any ill side effects, while Nora took the memory wipe brew. They looked almost identical to the untrained eye. After taking a swallow of ale to wash it down, Nora frowned. What was I saying? Ah, yes, our good friend Anya. I stopped in to check on her at the academy. She's in expert hands with Imelda. Of course it will take some time to undo the damage. She's a careful sort as a physician, but the bigger problem is keeping her grandsons in check while they visit her in the ward. Better in the hands of witches than wizards, though. I suppose we have your sister to thank for that. Here's hoping that Malachi Swiftwind will be punished sufficiently in that tower of theirs, too. Even if they've kept Benton's name out of the papers, the Baron of Greenhaven will make sure he is ruined in society circles. Gretchen leaned back, a satisfied smile tugging at her lips as she regarded Nora's assessment of the situation. With Nora Brightstar involved, there were bound to be no loose ends left dangling. Then something caught her notice out of the corner of her eye, and she glanced at a table tucked away behind the stage. A hooded figure sat staring at her with a mug of ale raised in some sort of toast, the deep wrinkles of his face arranged in a wide grin. Gretchen blinked, but the apparition didn't disappear like she figured it ought to. Her eyes darted between Nora and Larkspire, but her friend appeared to be so caught up in her own musings that Gretchen might very well have been a lamppost for all it mattered. Swallowing, she turned her attention back to Larkspire with her ale in hand, raising it in a subtle toast before taking a sip. The imp gulped from his own cup, and Gretchen stiffened in her seat, hoping she hadn't just unwittingly invited him over to send them on some other quest. But when she glanced at Nora and back again, Larkspire, the minor god of luck, had disappeared. Gretchen let go of a tense breath and slumped into her seat. "What do you say?" Gretchen blinked and tried to recall what Nora had been gabbing about while she'd only been listening with half an ear. "Honestly, I'd be happy if I never sat through another game of Jitterball again. Maybe you should see if Jurgen wants to come with you. Besides, I'll probably be spending most of my free time in the foreseeable future bent over a hot cauldron replacing my supplies." Nora pursed her lips. "I suppose you've already splashed Mr. Silverthorn's coin around at the alchemist's shop, then?" "You betcha." Gretchen grinned widely. "Speaking of which, potions to brew and customers to see to. Where are you off to next?" "Oh, just another dusty old heirloom which needs reuniting with its deceased owner in some forsaken graveyard in the mountains." "A witch's work is never done, eh?" Gretchen held the small of her back as she stood and hobbled toward the door with her friend in step beside her. "Of course not," Nora said briskly. "Can't have bored witches getting about, can we? There'd be no end of trouble." Gretchen cackled on the way out, her laughter echoing through the tavern and earning a startled jump from a boy who'd been loitering by the door, his hand dipping into a barrel, undoubtedly up to mischief. While witches would never be lauded in the city like wizards were, Gretchen mused, there was always a use for them in the shadows, where their unique skills could work their magic unseen. And as she stepped into the bustling city streets, Gretchen couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction knowing that she and Nora had emerged victorious, even if their triumph remained hidden from the public eye. After all, in a city like this, there was never a dull moment for a witch with a knack for trouble. Thanks for listening to Jitterball, from the collection of Gretchen's new adventures. If you enjoyed this audiobook, consider subscribing to P.A. Mason's channel to make sure you keep up to date with new books as they're published. Until then, happy listening.